Welcome, friends. Come on in and get comfortable. Whether you're curled beneath a familiar blanket, resting your head against a soft pillow, or simply sitting somewhere quiet as the evening grows dim, I'm glad you're here. Perhaps the last light outside has already faded. Perhaps a lamp is glowing softly nearby while the ordinary noises of the day have begun to disappear. This is the hour for slowing down, for letting thoughts become less hurried, and for allowing an older world to emerge gently from the darkness. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past. And let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now settle back. Pull the blanket a little closer if the night is cool. Let the room around you become quiet. Tonight we're stepping back into the medieval centuries toward the towers, gatehouses, chapels and stone corridors of castles that still seem to rise from the landscape of Europe like pieces of an unfinished dream. In paintings and stories, these castles are often warm places. Fires roar in enormous hearths. Candles glow against polished tables. Lords feast beneath colourful banners while snow falls harmlessly beyond the walls. The reality was considerably colder. To understand why it helps to begin not with the people who lived inside a castle, nor with their fires or their winter clothing, but with the castle itself. With stone. Stone was a remarkable material for defence. It resisted flame better than timber. It could withstand weather violence, and if the builders were fortunate and skilled generations of use. A stone wall might outlive the lord who ordered it, the masons who shaped it, and the soldiers who first guarded its battlements. Yet stone had no interest in human comfort. A castle wall could be several feet thick, especially around important towers or vulnerable sections of a fortress. These enormous masses of masonry absorbed the temperature of their surroundings slowly. During a long winter, cold entered the stone little by little. Frost settled on the landscape. Rain struck the outer walls. Snow gathered in shaded corners of the courtyard. The days remained short, and the weak winter sun often failed to reach much of the building. Gradually the walls became cold, and once they were cold, they remained cold. No one can quite agree on exactly how miserable every medieval castle was in winter, because castles varied enormously in age, design, climate, wealth, and location. A royal residence in southern France was not the same as a mountain fortress in Wales or a border castle facing the winds of northern England. Yet surviving buildings, household records, architectural evidence, and scattered written complaints all suggest the same quiet truth. Masonry buildings could hold winter's chill with extraordinary persistence. Even when spring returned, the stone was sometimes slow to notice. Outside fields might begin to soften beneath warmer rain. Villagers could see early plants appearing beside hedges. Birds returned to roofs and church towers. Along muddy roads, pilgrims once again travelled in greater numbers, their cloaks damp from showers rather than snow. Inside the castle, however, a chamber might still feel as though February had simply decided to remain. The problem began near the earth itself. Many castles were built on high ground for defensive reasons, but their lower rooms and foundations were still vulnerable to moisture. Stone and mortar could draw dampness from the soil. Rainwater found cracks. Drainage systems, where they existed, were rarely perfect. In older fortifications, centuries of repairs might create strange channels where moisture gathered behind walls or beneath floors. A person entering a lower chamber could sometimes smell the damp before feeling it. The scent was earthy and mineral mixed, perhaps with smoke from a nearby hearth. Old timber stored grain leather, and the faint mustiness of rushes scattered across the floor. Rushes were commonly used on floors in various medieval households though the exact practice differed from place to place and century to century. Fresh rushes could provide a softer, less icy surface beneath shoes, and aromatic herbs were sometimes mixed among them. Sweet flag, lavender, mint, or other plants might be added where they were available. This was partly practical and partly pleasant. Medieval people were not indifferent to smell, despite what later stereotypes sometimes suggest. A well-managed household could take pride in fresh floor coverings and fragrant herbs. Yet old rushes, especially when neglected, might trap dirt crumbs, dampness, and insects. Replacing them required labour, and in winter everything seemed to dry more slowly. A servant crossing a chamber at dawn might step carefully over a floor that felt damp beneath the rushes. A wooden chest pushed against an exterior wall could develop a cold, clammy surface. Wool clothing stored too close to moisture might smell stale. Leather required care. Manuscripts costly and precious had to be protected from damp chambers whenever possible. The castle itself seemed to breathe cold water from the earth. Medieval builders understood many practical aspects of their craft with impressive skill. Masons knew how to shape arches, raise vaults, and construct walls capable of surviving enormous pressure. They understood local stone and learned through experience how buildings weathered, but they did not possess modern damp-proof membranes, insulated foundations, or sealed cavities. A wall was expected first of all to stand. Comfort came later, and this distinction shaped the lives lived within it. Imagine not as a role to play, but simply as an image observed from a distance, a castle household waking on a winter morning. The night has passed without any central heating because there is no such system. The embers in some hearths have faded. Other fireplaces were never lit at all. Servants are beginning to move through passages, their shoes touching cold stone steps polished by years of use. Some wear woolen caps indoors, others keep cloaks around their shoulders while working. A kitchen boy carries a basket of kindling. In a chamber above, a clerk rubs stiff fingers before attempting to write. Somewhere near the chapel, a bell marks the hour its sound travelling over walls and frozen fields. The stone has been waiting all night. It has surrendered almost none of its cold. One lesser-known habit of medieval households was the extensive use of textiles, not merely for decoration, but for practical protection from uncomfortable interiors. Wall hangings, woven cloths, and later elaborate tapestries could reduce the sensation of cold radiating from bare masonry. Even simple fabric suspended against a wall created a small layer of trapped air. The richest hangings displayed hunting scenes, saints, heraldic symbols, gardens, or stories recognizable to those who saw them. Poorer households used what they possessed, but a bare wall remained a difficult companion in January. People sometimes associated unusual cold with northern weather. Medieval beliefs varied greatly, and church teachings existed alongside local traditions that were far older and often stubbornly persistent. A chamber that remained strangely cold might inspire whispers. Some claimed certain places were troubled by spirits. Others feared that a death in the room had left something behind. Protective crosses, prayers, blessed objects, or small charms might be used according to the beliefs of the household. The clergy did not always approve of folk charms. That did not mean people stopped carrying them. Some chroniclers claim that supernatural disturbances revealed themselves through sudden cold, although those who recorded such stories rarely agreed about what had actually occurred. A modern observer might point toward damp walls, drafts, poor ventilation, and a fire that had gone out. A medieval resident might quietly say a prayer. Perhaps both reactions in their own ways came from the same discomfort. Stone rooms could feel strangely alive when darkness settled. As evening returned, the castle's shaded walls lost what little warmth the day had offered. Towers cast long shadows across courtyards. North-facing chambers might receive almost no direct sunlight for weeks at a time. Narrow windows limited heat from the sun even further. Beyond the walls, wind moved through leafless trees. A distant village settled beneath smoke rising from low roofs. Somewhere on the road, a traveller hurried toward an abbey guesthouse before the gates closed. Bells drifted faintly through the winter air, measured and patient. Inside the fortress, candle flames shivered. The walls remained still. This was perhaps the most surprising thing about Castle Cold. It was not always dramatic. People did not spend every moment shaking violently or staring miserably at ice. Daily life continued. Bread was cut. Ale was poured. Accounts were counted. Prayers were spoken. Boots were repaired. Messages arrived with mud on their seals and rain on the messenger's cloak. Cold simply accompanied these things. It waited in stairwells. It rested against the backs of wooden benches. It entered clothing when someone leaned against a wall. It lingered in unused chambers where a breath might briefly cloud the air on the hardest mornings. And it reminded everyone that a castle, despite its towers and grandeur, had been built as a machine of endurance rather than a home of effortless warmth. The thick walls that protected a household from arrows, raiders, and siege engines were the same walls that gathered months of winter cold. Their strength was also their indifference. A lord could command servants collect tolls, hold a manor court, and send riders across his lands. He could not command several thousand tons of frozen masonry to become warm before spring, so the people inside adapted. They learned which rooms caught sunlight. They recognized the dampest corners. They moved furniture away from certain walls. They hung cloth where they could. They covered themselves in wool and fur and waited for fires to be lit. And all around them, silent and ancient, even when newly built, the stone kept the memory of winter. The cold held in the stone was only the beginning, because the rooms within a castle were rarely designed to contain warmth in the way a modern house does. The great hall, the beating heart of many medieval households, was especially impressive and especially difficult to heat. It was a room built to be seen. High roofs rose above long wooden tables. Heavy beams crossed overhead, sometimes darkened by decades of smoke. Banners or woven hangings might soften the walls in wealthier residences. At one end stood the raised dais, where the lord, his family, and honoured guests could sit above the rest of the household. Servants moved continually between kitchen doors and tables. Messengers waited near entrances. Hounds slept beneath benches when permitted. Clerks, soldiers, visiting monks, estate officials and retainers all passed through the same broad space. During a feast with dozens or even hundreds of bodies gathered together, the hall could become lively and comparatively warm. But before dawn, it was another place entirely. The height of the roof allowed warm air to rise far above the people who needed it. Heat from a central hearth or fireplace drifted upward toward beams and rafters, leaving colder air close to the floor. Those seated at tables might feel warmth on one side of the face while their feet remained chilled beneath the bench. Medieval people had no knowledge of modern thermodynamics, yet they understood the problem through experience. They sat close to fires. They wore layers indoors. They chose seats carefully. A place near the hearth could carry quiet social value, especially in winter. Older servants favoured retainers, and important visitors might find themselves better positioned than those considered less significant. No one can quite agree whether seating customs around every medieval hearth were strictly regulated, but household hierarchy shaped almost every part of castle life, and warmth was too precious to be entirely separated from rank. The great hall also suffered from doors. A castle household was rarely still during daylight. Wood had to be carried in. Water had to be brought from wells or cisterns. Food moved from kitchens. Guards changed watch. Stable workers entered with messages. Officials arrived from nearby manors. Petitioners sometimes waited for judgment or assistance. Every opening of a heavy oak door allowed cold air to enter. The door itself might fit badly within the stone arch. Timber changed shape as it aged and absorbed moisture. Iron hinges wore down. Thresholds became uneven under generations of boots. Leather curtains or cloth hangings were sometimes used inside doorways to reduce drafts, yet the seal remained imperfect. On a windy day, a person could sometimes identify a doorway without looking toward it. The cold announced its position. Rushes spread across the floor helped slightly. They created a thin barrier between shoes and stone or packed earth, though their main purposes included cleanliness and comfort rather than insulation alone. In some households, fresh herbs were scattered among them. Rosemary, lavender, or sweet-smelling plants might improve the atmosphere at least until muddy boots and spilled ale altered the scent. The rushes also made footsteps softer. This mattered in a room filled with people. A medieval hall could be noisy even without entertainment. Wooden bowls struck tables. Trenchers were moved. Dogs shifted beneath benches. Servants called quietly to one another. A steward attempted to maintain order. Somewhere someone coughed into a wool sleeve, and through it all draughts moved unnoticed between ankles. Meals were shaped partly by this environment. Pottage, a thick mixture of grains, vegetables, herbs, and sometimes meat, offered warmth as well as nourishment. A bowl held between two hands had a comfort difficult to measure in household accounts. Fresh bread roasted food and warm sauces briefly raised both spirits and temperature. Ale was common, often consumed because it formed part of ordinary diet and hospitality. Its strength varied considerably, and historians continue to debate many details of brewing practice across different regions and centuries. In winter, spiced or warmed drinks were known in some wealthy households, though they were not the universal daily luxury that romantic stories sometimes suggest. More often, comfort came from ordinary food eaten quickly before it cooled. A wooden trencher could hold meat or bread, but it could not keep February away. The architecture of the hall worked constantly against the fire. Tall windows, even when narrow, offered another path for cold. Before widespread glazed windows, shutters were common. These could block wind, but they also blocked light. When shutters were opened during a winter day, pale sunlight entered alongside colder air. Horn-oiled cloth or other translucent materials were sometimes used in window openings. Glass existed, of course, especially in churches and the wealthiest buildings, but large areas of clear glazing remained expensive for much of the medieval period. A castle resident therefore faced a simple choice on many dark days: light or shelter. Often the room lived somewhere between the two. Candles helped, although even here rank was visible. Beeswax candles burned more cleanly and produced a pleasant scent, but they were costly. Tallow candles made from animal fat were far more common and could smoke or smell unpleasantly. Lamps using oil were also known. A great hall after sunset might appear beautiful from a distance with points of flame reflecting from metal cups and illuminating painted shields. Closer to the wall it was still cold. One curious practice involved the use of portable braziers or pans containing hot coals. These could offer local warmth, though they also created dangers. Charcoal fumes in poorly ventilated spaces could be harmful, even if medieval people did not fully understand the reason. Fires themselves were an ever-present concern in buildings containing timber roofs, straw cloth rushes, and dry furnishings. Some believed certain saints could protect households from fire. St. Florian later became strongly associated with protection against flames in parts of Europe, while other regions called upon local saints or used blessed objects according to custom. Whether such protections brought reassurance or genuine confidence is difficult to know. The hearthkeeper still watched the embers. A neglected spark could destroy more than a winter night's comfort. As the evening deepened, the hall slowly changed. The day's officials departed. Servants cleared tables. Leftover bread might be collected sometimes for later use, sometimes for distribution according to household custom. Hounds raised their heads as benches scraped across the floor. Beyond the walls, wind moved across dark fields. A chapel bell sounded somewhere in the castle precinct, followed perhaps by the more distant bell of a village church. Rain tapped against wooden shutters. In the courtyard, a guard crossed frozen ground beneath a cloak, his lantern throwing a weak circle of light across the stones. Inside, the great fire settled lower. People drew closer without discussing why. This quiet movement toward warmth was repeated across countless evenings. A soldier stretched his hands toward the flames. A clerk protected his writing fingers within his sleeves. A servant paused beside the hearth for a few moments longer than necessary before returning to work. Such behavior was ordinary enough to escape most records. Medieval documents tell us what land was worth, how much grain was collected, who owed service, which marriages were arranged, and which disputes reached a court. They rarely record the small moment when someone turned a cold shoulder toward a fire, yet those moments shaped daily life. The great hall was meant to display authority and community. Here the Lord could receive guests, hear petitions, celebrate holy days, reward loyalty, and demonstrate wealth. Its size carried meaning. A small room could never create the same impression as a roof rising high above rows of household retainers. But grandeur had a cost. The larger the hall, the more air waited to be warmed. The higher the roof, the farther the heat climbed. The more people and goods passed through its doors, the more often winter entered with them. Tapestries could help. Wooden screens near doorways could help. Fires could help. Thick clothes could help. Nothing solved the problem completely. Some of the most comfortable places were often those accidentally created by the architecture itself. A corner screened by furniture, a bench near the kitchen entrance, a space beside an interior wall rather than an exterior one, a small recess where air moved less freely. People remembered these places. A servant who'd lived in the castle for 20 years knew more about its drafts than any visiting nobleman. He knew which stairwell became unbearable during an east wind. She knew which bench remained cold even beside the fire. They knew that one door should be closed quickly and another had to be lifted slightly before its latch would catch. The castle became understandable through repetition, and repetition was the rhythm of medieval life. Bells marked hours, meals followed household custom, servants rose before their masters, fires were rebuilt, doors opened, doors closed, the great hall filled, the great hall emptied, and above everything, near the soot-dark rafters where warm air disappeared beyond reach, the roof waited in shadow while those below wrapped themselves more tightly in wool. The great hall could never hold warmth for long, and much of the blame rested with the fires themselves. Medieval castles certainly had fires. They had hearths, braziers, glowing coals, and eventually great stone fireplaces that seemed to modernize large enough to warm an entire house. Yet the presence of flame did not guarantee a comfortable room. For many centuries, the simplest hearth was little more than a controlled fire built on a prepared surface, often near the center of a hall. Smoke rose toward openings in the roof where it was expected to escape through a louver vent or smoke hole. Expected was the important word. Smoke had its own opinions. On calm days it might drift upward in a grey column and vanish into the rafters. On windy days, changing pressure could force it sideways. A gust through a doorway might flatten the smoke over the floor before it rose again. People sitting nearest the fire gained the most heat, but they also faced sparks, ash, and the occasional eye-watering cloud. Some chroniclers claim that certain halls became so smoke-filled that conversation was difficult, though those who recorded such complaints never fully agreed on how common the worst conditions were. Medieval households differed greatly. A well-managed royal residence could employ experienced servants who understood how to tend fires carefully. A smaller fortress with damaged vents and damp fuel might be considerably less pleasant. Wood was the foundation of most castle heating. It was also work. Trees had to be cut, branches trimmed, logs split, and fuel transported. Timber needed time to dry. Wet wood produced more smoke and less useful heat. A winter fire therefore began months earlier in a forest when woodcutters marked trees and axes struck trunks beneath green leaves. Castle estates often possessed rights over nearby woodland. These rights could be complicated. Lords controlled forests, tenants might have customary privileges to gather fallen branches, and villagers could face penalties for taking timber without permission. The right to gather deadwood was sometimes known by customary terms that varied by region. Such rights mattered deeply to ordinary families. A noble household might order wagon loads of logs. A widow in a village might depend upon whatever sticks she was legally permitted to collect. Market tolls could also be placed upon fuel entering towns. Warmth had a price. Within a castle, servants carried that price on their backs. A boy or labourer could spend much of the morning hauling baskets of kindling from a dry store. Larger logs came by cart and were stacked beneath sheds or against protected walls. In a busy household, fires consumed wood with astonishing speed. The daily routine of fire tending began before most nobles left their beds. Ash had to be cleared. Old embers were examined. A skilled servant might preserve a living coal beneath the ashes overnight, making the morning fire easier to revive. Where embers had died completely flame could be created using flint and steel with dry tinder. Tinder might include charred cloth, dry fungus, fine bark, or carefully prepared plant material. The process required patience. A spark caught first as a tiny glowing point. Breath encouraged it. Fine kindling followed. Only then could larger wood be added. For a person kneeling on a cold floor before dawn, a successful flame must have seemed like a small victory. There were folk beliefs surrounding fire as well. In some communities, people treated the hearth with a respect that went beyond simple usefulness. Embers were not always considered ordinary waste. Certain traditions associated the continuity of household flame with fortune or protection. Customs varied, and historians continue to debate how widespread individual beliefs truly were, but the hearth often carried symbolic meaning. Fire represented the household itself. To let it die at the wrong time could feel unlucky. At particular festivals, flames might be extinguished and relit according to local or religious tradition. Blessed candles were sometimes kept for use during storms or moments of danger. Candlemas, candles blessed in church, could be saved in households and lit when protection was sought. The castle hearth stood somewhere between practical necessity and old human reverence. Yet no blessing could make an open fire efficient. Much of its heat travelled directly upward. People warmed themselves through radiant heat from the flames, which meant distance mattered greatly. A person seated 6 feet away might be reasonably comfortable on the side facing the hearth, while remaining cold everywhere else. Turn around and the back chilled. Move to another table and the warmth disappeared. Large hearths also demanded ventilation. Fire needed air. The more fiercely it burned, the more air it drew into the room. That air had to come from somewhere. It came beneath doors. It came through window gaps. It came along passageways. The fire that warmed the hall also helped pull cold air into it. No one in the medieval household would have explained the process with modern pressure diagrams. They simply knew that some rooms became more drafty when the fire burned strongly. Early chimneys gradually changed this experience. A chimney could carry smoke more directly away from an interior, allowing fires to be placed against walls. This made wall fireplaces possible and transformed the design of domestic rooms. But chimneys did not spread everywhere at once. They were expensive to build properly. Masonry flues required knowledge and materials. An incorrectly constructed chimney could smoke badly, crack, or create a fire hazard. Older castles sometimes had fireplaces added during later renovations, with flues awkwardly incorporated into existing walls. In wealthier buildings, fireplaces became important architectural features. Stone surrounds could be carved with shields or decorative patterns. A large chamber might possess an impressive hearth, wide enough for several people to stand close beside it. The size could be misleading. A huge fireplace might consume enormous quantities of wood while warming only a portion of the room. Servants understood this better than visitors. They adjusted logs with iron pokers. They moved burning wood using tongs. They swept sparks away from rushes. Fire dogs or andirons supported logs and allowed air to circulate beneath them. In kitchens, hooks and cranes suspended pots above flames. The height of a cooking vessel could be altered to control heat. A pot of pottage could simmer for hours. Fish might be smoked nearby. Bread dough waited elsewhere for the ovens. The kitchen was often one of the warmest parts of a castle, but it was not necessarily comfortable. Heat, steam, smoke, sweat, and constant labour filled the room. A cook working beside open flame could be hot while a servant waiting near the outer door remained cold. Kitchen workers sometimes slept near their workplace, though arrangements varied. Stable hands, guards, and lower servants also found sleeping places wherever household organisation allowed. Warmth influenced these choices. A position near a chimney wall could offer slight comfort, because warmed masonry sometimes released heat slowly after a fire had faded. This was one of the strange contradictions of castle stone. Once cold, it held cold. Once thoroughly warmed, a section of masonry could also hold heat. The difficulty was warming enough of it. As evening rain began to strike the roofs, fires brightened across the castle. Smoke escaped from chimneys in twisting streams and vanished into darkness. In the courtyard, wood stacks stood beneath rough shelters. A servant crossed the stones, carrying another armful of logs, his cloak damp at the shoulders. Beyond the gate, the road had become mud. A traveller approaching from a nearby abbey could see the faint red glow of windows, and perhaps imagine luxurious warmth within. The truth was gentler and colder. Near the hearth hands were warm. At the end of the hall, breath might still show. A lord's chamber could have a fire, yet the corner farthest from it remained chilly. A clerk might place his stool close enough to feel heat without risking sparks on parchment. Someone warming boots too near the flames could damage the leather. There was even a quiet art to drying wet clothing. Too close and wool could scorch. Too far away and it remained damp through the night. Castle life involved constant negotiations with fire. Feed it, watch it, move closer, step away, carry more wood, clear more ash, close the door, open the vent. The flames were never simply decoration. They required attention every day from before sunrise until the household finally settled into darkness. And when the last logs collapsed inward, sending brief sparks toward the chimney, the warmth faded surprisingly quickly. The stone waited nearby. The drafts continued through unseen gaps. The halls slowly surrendered once more to winter. The fire might fade, but the wind remained patient. It found every weakness in the castle. A narrow gap around a door, a badly fitted shutter, a stair rising through an unheated tower. A slit cut into the wall for archers. Even the passage beneath the door could become a road by which winter entered the household. Castles had openings because they needed them. They needed doors large enough for people, carts, horses, barrels, and supplies. They needed windows for light. They needed arrow slits for defense. They needed vents for smoke. They needed passages connecting towers, halls, kitchens, chapels, storerooms, and private chambers. Every opening solved one problem and created another. The arrow slit was perhaps the clearest example. From outside it appeared as a narrow vertical cut in the stone, sometimes crossed by a shorter horizontal opening. A defender could stand within a wider recess behind it and fire outward while remaining protected by thick masonry. For battle it was useful, for winter less so. Wind passed through the slit with remarkable ease. Even when the outer opening was small, the deep recess behind it could channel air into the chamber. A guard standing nearby for hours might feel cold gather along one side of his body. Some slits could be covered with wooden boards, cloth, or other improvised barriers when defence was not immediately required. Yet many remained imperfectly sealed. No one can quite agree whether castle residents complained more about smoke or drafts, because most medieval writers had other concerns. They recorded wars, marriages, saints, taxes, disputes, and unusual weather. They rarely wrote that a particular corridor was unpleasant because wind entered through a northern arrow loop. But buildings preserve evidence where documents remain quiet. The shape of defensive architecture tells its own story. Windows offered similar difficulties. In a wealthy castle, some important chambers might possess glass. Medieval glass was valuable, and large clear panes familiar to modern houses did not exist in the same form. Small pieces could be set into lead frames, sometimes coloured or decorated. A chapel window might glow beautifully when the sun passed through it. Beauty did not always mean insulation. Lead-framed glass could leak air around damaged edges. Panes cracked. Frames warped. Repairs waited for skilled craftsmen. In lesser rooms, wooden shutters remained common. Closing them blocked wind. Closing them also blocked daylight. This created a strange winter interior. A room could be protected from the worst weather and still remain dim at midday. Candles or lamps were then needed. Tallow smoke joined hearth smoke. Shadows gathered behind chests and along stone walls. If shutters were opened, pale light entered. So did cold. The choice was repeated each day. A clerk might prefer light because parchment demanded careful eyes. A lady sewing fine cloth needed brightness. A steward examining accounts needed to distinguish marks and figures. A servant might open a shutter and immediately hear someone ask that it be closed again. Such small disagreements were surely ordinary, though they rarely reached any written record. Doors created their own problems. Castle doors are often imagined as enormous slabs of oak strengthened with iron straps, and some certainly were. Gatehouse doors and important entrances could be massive. Their weight helped resist force. Interior doors were more varied. Wood shrank and expanded with moisture. Hinges sagged. Floors shifted. Stone arches settled over decades. A door that fit well when new could later leave an uneven gap. Servants developed practical solutions. Rolled cloth could be placed near thresholds. Curtains might hang behind entrances. Wooden screens could stand inside halls to slow the rush of cold air from frequently used doors. The screen's passage became a familiar feature in some great halls, creating a barrier between the main room and service entrances. It was architecture learning from discomfort. Even then, a door opened dozens of times a day. The castle had not become a sealed box. Messengers arrived from manor houses carrying letters beneath wax seals. Priests crossed between chapel and hall. Soldiers entered from the battlements. Merchants sometimes delivered cloth, salt, spices, ironwork, or barrels of wine. Mud followed them. Rain followed them. Cold followed them. The main gate was especially troublesome. When opened, it created a wide entrance into the castle enclosure. Gatehouses were designed with security in mind. Portcullises, heavy doors, murder holes, and guarded passages made entry difficult for enemies. Wind did not care about fortifications. It passed through whenever the gate stood open. A winter gust could sweep into the courtyard carrying rain or loose snow. Stable doors rattled. Chickens, if any wandered near, moved quickly toward shelter. A groom tightened his cloak. The courtyard itself became a cold basin between stone walls. In wet weather, water gathered in channels and depressions. In freezing conditions, stone surfaces became dangerous. People used straw ash sand or whatever rough material was available to improve footing. Some believed that carrying certain herbs or charms offered protection against falls or sudden injury. Local traditions differed widely. A traveller might carry a small blessed object or pilgrim badge obtained at a shrine, believing it offered protection along dangerous roads. A castle servant slipping on frozen steps probably relied more immediately on the railing. Staircases were another source of cold. Many castle stairs rose within towers or wall passages. Spiral staircases connected floors while occupying little space. They were defensible and structurally practical. They were rarely warm. Air moved vertically through stairwells. Cold air descended. Warm air rose. A person opening a door onto a tower stair could feel the difference immediately. Some staircases possess small windows or arrow slits for light, creating further drafts. Stone steps remained cold beneath leather shoes. The inner side of a spiral stair wore smooth over years of use. At dawn, servants climbed these stairs before the household stirred. One carried a jug of water. Another carried kindling. Another held folded linen. Their breath might cloud faintly in the air. They knew where the steps were uneven. They knew where the wind entered. They moved carefully in darkness. Daily life depended on people learning the moods of the building. A castle was not simply cold everywhere in the same way. It possessed currents. A passage beside the kitchen chimney might be almost pleasant. A north tower could remain bitter. A chamber above a crowded hall might be warmer than one above an empty storeroom. A southern wall gathered more sunlight. A doorway facing the prevailing wind could whistle all night. The household learned these differences over years. A newly arrived bride from another region might discover that the chamber assigned to her was colder than expected. A visiting nobleman might request another room, perhaps politely, perhaps not. A servant already knew which chamber would be difficult. But status determined who could complain. For guards, cold openings were part of duty. Watchmen stood on battlements, walls, and tower platforms where shelter was limited. They wore wool leather and, when available, fur-lined garments. Cloaks could be drawn close around the body. A brazier might provide warmth in a guardroom. Outside there was only movement. Walking helped. Stamping feet helped. Hot food helped when it arrived. A watchman might receive bread, cheese, onions, smoked fish, or pottage, depending on household arrangements. Warm ale or another heated drink was a greater comfort when available. Some castle guards believed strange noises carried by the wind predicted trouble. A cry from the forest, a dog howling near the gate, or an unexplained whistle around a tower could inspire uneasy interpretation. Those who recorded such beliefs never fully agreed on their meaning. One village might regard an owl as an omen, another treated it as simply an owl. At night wind made castles speak. It moved beneath doors, it hummed through narrow openings, it shook shutters, it carried the distant sound of bells. A loose iron fitting tapped against stone, a hanging stirred without anyone touching it. Modern buildings hide much of the weather. Medieval castles admitted it. Rain could be heard against shutters, storms pressed against doors. Cold could be felt approaching down a corridor before anyone saw the entrance open. The people inside accepted much of this because they had no alternative. They adjusted clothing, they placed screens, they hung fabric, they blocked gaps, they moved chairs. Small repairs were made constantly. A carpenter might plane a swollen door. A mason filled a crack with mortar. A servant stuffed cloth into a stubborn window gap. Nothing remained fixed forever. Stone endured. Everything fitted into stone slowly loosened. And so winter continued to search. As night settled over the castle, shutters closed one by one. Oak doors dropped onto latches. Guards checked entrances. The last servants crossed the courtyard beneath lantern light. Mist moved over the fields beyond the walls. Somewhere along a muddy road a late traveller hurried toward shelter. The castle looked solid from a distance. Dark towers rose against the sky. Walls seemed impenetrable. Yet inside a candle flame leaned slightly toward an unseen gap. A curtain stirred. Cold air slipped beneath a door. Winter had entered again. Morning did not arrive in a medieval castle with sudden brightness. It entered slowly first as a paling of the darkness beyond the shutters, then as a thin grey line around the edges of wood and cloth. In winter the household might already be awake before the sun had properly risen. The bells helped decide when the day began. A chapel bell within the castle or the distant voice of a nearby monastery could mark the hours long before daylight. The rhythm of prayer divided time differently from the clock-bound habits of later centuries. Matins lauds and the other canonical hours belonged most formally to religious communities, but bells shaped the wider medieval soundscape as well. They travelled over frozen fields, they crossed village roofs, they reached the castle walls faint and solemn. Inside, servants were already moving. The first task was often fire. Cold chambers had spent the night returning to the temperature of the stone around them. A hearth that had seemed comforting before sleep was now a bed of grey ash, with perhaps one hidden ember beneath it. A servant knelt, searched carefully, and began the slow work of rebuilding warmth. Kindling crackled. Smoke rose. A small flame caught. The room did not become warm. Not yet. Elsewhere, water was carried through corridors in jugs and buckets. On the coldest mornings, water stored in exposed places could develop a skin of ice. Wells might remain usable, but ropes grew stiff, and wet hands quickly became painful. Washing was usually practical rather than luxurious. A noble might receive water in a basin, perhaps warmed when circumstances allowed. Hands and face could be washed. Cloths were used. In wealthy households, scented water containing herbs or flowers sometimes appeared especially on important occasions. Rose water had long been valued where trade and expense permitted. Most mornings were simpler. A servant placed the basin. The water cooled quickly. The person washing learned not to linger. Some medieval medical theories encourage particular habits concerning temperature. Physicians working within the tradition of the four humours believed the body depended upon balances of heat, cold moisture and dryness. Cold weather might be thought to affect digestion, temperament, or vulnerability to illness. Advice differed. Some practitioners recommended warming foods, others prescribed herbs. There were remedies involving sage rue fennel, or wine prepared with spices. No one can quite agree how closely ordinary castle residents followed learned medical guidance in their daily lives. Written medical texts often reveal what educated physicians believed should happen rather than what every person actually did. An elderly guard with aching fingers might trust a warm cloth more than a theory of humours. A kitchen maid might rub sore hands with animal fat or herbal salve. Someone else might carry a charm. Life continued through practical experiments. After washing came clothing. Winter dress was not one garment but a construction of layers. Linen might be worn close to the body with wool garments above it. Tunics, gowns, stockings, hoods, caps and cloaks offered protection according to wealth and occupation. Getting dressed in a freezing room encouraged efficiency. Fabric felt cold at first. Leather belts were stiff. Shoes waiting near the bed might have absorbed the chill of the floor. In some chambers, servants warmed clothing near a fire, but this required care. Wool could scorch. Fur could be damaged. A sleeve forgotten too close to flame could fill the room with an unpleasant smell. The household slowly assembled itself. Doors opened. Footsteps crossed passages. A priest prepared for prayer. A steward considered the day's work. The kitchens produced the first substantial warmth. Breakfast customs varied by time, region, status, and religious practice. The modern expectation of a large morning meal does not fit neatly into every medieval household. Some people ate lightly, others began work before taking much food. Bread was constant, ale was common, leftover pottage might return to the fire. During fasting periods, religious rules shaped what could be served. Meat might be restricted, with fish taking its place according to church custom. Smoked or salted fish could travel far from the coast. Herring became especially important in many regions. Salt preserved it. Smoke preserved it. Neither necessarily made it delicate. A winter table might hold bread, cheese, fish, and ale while the household prepared for hours of work. Those hours moved slowly. The lord or his officials might hear disputes concerning land rents, service-damaged fences, unpaid tolls, or wandering animals. Manor courts elsewhere dealt with many such matters, but castle households also became centres of administration. A clerk sat with parchment. Ink thickened in the cold. This was a genuine inconvenience. Ink preparation varied, but iron, gall ink was widely used in medieval Europe. Made through processes involving oak galls, iron, compounds, and other ingredients, it could behave differently depending on preparation and temperature. A clerk needed light. He needed steady fingers. He needed parchment that was not damp. The castle offered none of these things automatically. He might sit close to a window for daylight. Then he became cold. He might sit closer to the hearth. Then smoke or shadow made writing difficult. The written administration of medieval estates was created within such compromises. A charter that survives today may have been copied by a man whose feet were freezing beneath his stool. Nearby domestic work continued. Linen needed sorting. Clothing required mending. Food stores were checked. Candles were counted. Keys passed between responsible servants. Large households depended upon careful control of supplies. Wax salt flour, wine, dried peas, oats, fish fuel, and cloth all represented value. Winter made shortages more dangerous. Roads became difficult. Heavy rain turned roots into mud. Snow delayed carts. A bridge could flood. A merchant might arrive days later than expected. Castles could store provisions, especially when preparing for conflict, but everyday household management still depended upon movement between countryside market and fortress. Some chroniclers claimed winters of exceptional severity left roads almost impassable, though descriptions of medieval weather are not always easy to interpret. Writers often noticed unusual seasons precisely because they were unusual. For those living through them, however, the cold was immediate. A messenger entered the hall with mud hardened along his boots. His cloak steamed faintly near the fire. A servant brought him ale. Perhaps he carried news from an abbey. Perhaps a neighbouring lord had sent a sealed letter. Perhaps the message concerned nothing more dramatic than grain. Most medieval days were built from such ordinary matters. At midday the hall grew busier. Food provided a pause. Pottage appeared again in many forms, thickened with grains or legumes and flavoured with whatever the kitchen possessed. Onions, leeks, herbs, cabbage and peas were common ingredients in various regions. Meat reflected status and season. Pork, beef, mutton, poultry, or game might appear in wealthy households. Spices were valuable. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger and saffron entered Europe through long networks of trade. Their presence on a noble table could display wealth as clearly as fine cloth. Warm food was also simply welcome. People gathered nearer one another. Steam rose from bowls. For a little while the hall felt alive. Then the meal ended. Work resumed. Cold returned to notice. Winter afternoons were short. Light faded before tasks were finished. Candles became necessary and the cost of illumination shaped activity. Beeswax candles were prized for their cleaner flame, while tallow candles remained more common in less luxurious spaces. It was not sensible to burn unlimited light. Some work stopped when darkness came. Other work moved closer to a flame. The castle's pace narrowed with the day. Outside guards walked walls beneath the sky already darkening. In the village below, smoke gathered over roofs. A farmer checked animals before night. At an abbey, bells called monks back toward prayer. Mist crossed low fields. The sound of hooves on a road became softer in the mud. Inside the castle, evening did not feel like the conclusion of cold. It felt like preparation for another night of it. More wood was carried. Shutters were closed. Clothing was not immediately removed. People remained near the hall if they could. Stories might be told. Music sometimes appeared in noble households. Household members played games, talked, or completed small tasks beside the fire. But waiting was also part of winter. Waiting for weather to improve. Waiting for roads to dry. Waiting for a messenger. Waiting for Lent. Waiting for spring. Medieval life moved according to seasons more openly than modern life often does. Winter reduced the world. A castle that commanded miles of land could become for weeks a collection of cold rooms surrounded by wet fields. The inhabitants adjusted their ambitions. They rose. They prayed. They ate. They worked. They tended fires. They waited. And through the long evenings, as candlelight rested against damp stone, and footsteps faded from the passages, the castle held them quietly inside the season. The season could not be hurried, but the body could be defended against it. That defence began with cloth. In a world without heated bedrooms, insulated corridors, or reliably warm halls, clothing did work that architecture often failed to do. A castle resident did not necessarily expect the room to become comfortable. Instead, layers were arranged around the body until the cold became manageable. Wool was among the most important materials in medieval life. Sheep grazed across estates, hillsides, and open fields, and their fleeces supported an enormous network of work. Wool had to be sheared, sorted, cleaned, carded, spun, woven, dyed, cut, and sewn. Before a finished cloak rested across someone's shoulders, many hands had already touched the material. In villages, spinning was a familiar household occupation. A woman might work with a spindle while sitting near a doorway in better weather, or closer to the hearth during winter. Distaffs held prepared fibres. Spindle whorls helped maintain motion. Later spinning wheels spread more widely across Europe, though their adoption varied by region and period. Inside a castle, the finished cloth revealed status. Fine wool could be soft, closely woven and richly dyed. Coarser wool could scratch. Both could keep a person warmer. Layers usually mattered more than a single dramatic garment. Linen worn close to the skin helped separate the body from heavier outer clothes. Above this came tunics, gowns, or other garments shaped according to century, region, occupation, and rank. Fashion changed throughout the medieval period. Sleeves narrowed and widened. Hems rose and fell. Hoods developed long decorative tails. Some clothing became fitted closely to the body, while other garments relied upon folds and generous quantities of cloth. No one can quite agree on how quickly new fashions reached every remote castle or manor house. A royal court might display a new style, while an older servant in a distant fortress continued wearing garments cut according to habits learned decades before. Winter encouraged practicality. A cloak could cover fashion. Hoods protected the head and neck. Caps were worn indoors by many people. Stockings or hose covered the legs. Leather shoes separated feet from rushes and stone, although medieval footwear was rarely as insulated as a modern winter boot. Cold feet were an ordinary problem. People could wear additional cloth around the feet or use thicker hose. Felt and wool offered protection where available. Shoes stuffed with dry material may have been used in practical circumstances, though detailed evidence for every local habit remains uncertain. Dryness mattered nearly as much as warmth. A wool cloak dampened by rain became heavy. A servant returning from the outer yard might hang it near a hearth, carefully judging the distance from flame. Too close and sparks threatened the cloth. Too far away and the cloak remained wet until morning. In a large household, rows of garments might occupy pegs, chests, and benches. Clothing was valuable. It was repaired repeatedly. A torn sleeve was stitched. A worn edge was reinforced. Old cloth was reused. A noble's discarded garment could pass downward through the household, altered for another wearer. Eventually, pieces might become patches, wrappings, or rags. The idea of casually throwing away useful wool would have seemed strange in most medieval households. Even wealthy people recorded textiles carefully. Cloth appeared in wills. Garments were given as gifts. Liveries identified servants and retainers connected to a lord. A cloak could announce loyalty before anyone spoke, and in winter it announced something simpler. The wearer wished to remain warm. Fur provided another layer of protection. The popular image of medieval nobles buried beneath luxurious pelts contains some truth, although the type of fur mattered greatly. Squirrel, rabbit, lambskin, sheepskin, fox, and other furs were used in different places and contexts. Ermine became associated with high status and ceremonial display. Fur could line a cloak without dominating its outer appearance. A gown might appear to be made from fine wool, while hidden fur protected the wearer beneath. This made clothing almost architectural. The body carried its own walls. Air became trapped between fabric layers. Fur held warmth close. A hood created a small shelter around the head. A cloak acted as a movable curtain against drafts. The room remained cold. The person became less exposed to it. Sometimes garments stayed on for much of the day. Modern visitors to a reconstructed castle often look at a stone chamber and wonder why someone did not simply build a larger fire. A medieval resident might have regarded that question differently. Wood required labour and money. Clothing already surrounded the body. Why attempt to heat an entire high room when warmth could be kept much closer? This was not a formal theory. It was habit shaped by necessity. At meals, people could remain wrapped in outer garments if the hall was cold. Clerks might work with sleeves covering their wrists. Guards wore cloaks over military equipment when duty allowed. Even nobles did not spend every winter evening dressed lightly beside a roaring fire. Portraits, manuscripts, and surviving clothing records reveal the importance of layers, although images must be interpreted carefully. Artists had symbolic and decorative purposes. They did not always intend to record temperature. Still, the repeated presence of gowns, mantles, hoods, and fur tells a quiet story. Castle warmth was often worn. There were beliefs surrounding clothing as well. Certain colours carried associations. Specific materials could indicate rank or office. Religious pilgrims sometimes attached lead or pewter badges to hats and cloaks after visiting shrines. These pilgrim badges represented journeys to places connected with saints and relics. A badge from Canterbury, Santiago, or another shrine could become a visible sign of devotion. Some people also believed objects associated with holy places provided protection. A pilgrim crossing a winter road might touch such a badge during a storm. A castle resident suffering from persistent chills might seek the aid of a saint through prayer. Folk remedies existed beside formal devotion. Herbs could be sewn into small bags. Amulets might be carried beneath clothing. Written charms were sometimes folded and worn close to the body. Church authorities accepted some prayers and blessed objects while condemning practices considered superstitious or magical. The boundary was not always clear to ordinary people. A person freezing in a tower room was unlikely to begin a theological debate before putting on another cloak. There is one gentle truth here that has survived the centuries when people are cold. Dignity often becomes negotiable. An important official might wear an impressive fur-lined mantle. A kitchen boy might wrap himself in whatever wool was available. Both moved closer to warmth. As darkness gathered, garments became part of the evening ritual. Wet cloaks were hung. Hoods were removed or kept on according to the room. Belts loosened. Shoes were inspected for damp. A servant might brush mud from wool once it dried. Fine clothing required attention, especially if it had been exposed to rain or smoke. Moths and other insects threatened stored textiles. Herbs and aromatic plants were sometimes placed with clothing. Lavender, southernwood, and other strongly scented plants had traditional household uses. Cedar chests were not universally available despite their familiar place in later imagination, so medieval households relied on local materials and careful storage. Chests were important pieces of furniture. A heavy wooden chest could hold garments, linen, documents, or valuables. It might travel with a noble household moving between residences. Because medieval elites often moved from one estate to another, possessions needed to move as well. Tapestries travelled. Beds could be dismantled. Clothing crossed muddy roads packed in chests. Warmth was portable where walls were not. Outside, the winter wind continued over fields. Bare branches moved beside the road. At a nearby village, smoke escaped through roof openings, while families gathered in smaller houses where bodies, animals, and cooking fires sometimes created a different kind of warmth. Within the castle, a lady sat near a hearth with fur at her sleeves. A guard pulled a hood over his ears. A servant carried folded wool up a spiral stair. Far away, an abbey bell marked the darkening hour. The sound passed over frozen ground and reached the fortress faintly. Stone could not dress itself against winter. People could. They wrapped the body in sheep's wool-lined garments with fur covered the head, protected the neck, and learned that survival did not depend upon making every room warm. It depended upon keeping warmth from leaving the person too quickly. So beneath banners, beside great hearths and along corridors built for defence, medieval people carried small shelters around themselves. A layer of linen, a layer of wool, perhaps fur, a hood raised against the draught, and the quiet patience to endure until the bells of spring seemed a little less distant. Clothing protected the body during waking hours, but night created a different problem. Eventually the cloak had to be loosened, shoes were removed, the fire sank lower. Servants finished their final tasks, and the castle household withdrew from halls and passages into chambers that had spent the whole day absorbing winter. A bed therefore needed to do more than provide softness. It had to trap warmth. For wealthy medieval households, the bed could be among the most valuable objects in a chamber. It was not necessarily hidden away as a purely private piece of furniture. Fine beds represented status, and their hangings, coverings, frames, and embroidered textiles could be listed carefully among household possessions. Some travelled. A noble family moving from one residence to another might send bedding ahead with servants and carts. Beds could be dismantled curtains, folded blankets packed into chests, and valuable textiles protected from mud and rain. The stone chamber might belong to the castle. The warmth of the bed belonged to the household. Large bedsteads were commonly built from wood. Oak was used where available, though other timbers appeared according to region and resources. The frame supported ropes, boards, or other arrangements beneath the mattress. Mattresses varied enormously. The wealthy might sleep on feather-filled bedding. Others rested on mattresses stuffed with wool hay straw, or mixtures of available materials. Even within a noble castle, servants did not expect the same sleeping arrangements as the lord's family. A feather bed was expensive. Feathers had to be gathered, cleaned, and contained within strong cloth. Goose feathers were particularly valued in many places, though no one can quite agree how consistently medieval sources distinguished every type of filling in everyday speech. Feather bedding also required care. Moisture was an enemy. A damp chamber could affect cloth and filling. Bedding might be aired when weather permitted. Servants shook mattresses, inspected linen, and watched for insects. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were familiar difficulties throughout medieval life. People possessed remedies. Herbs were placed among bedding. Pennyroyal, wormwood, lavender, and other strongly scented plants appear in traditional practices intended to discourage insects. Some remedies involved smoke or washing. Their effectiveness varied. The determination behind them did not. A person already sleeping in a cold room had little desire to share the blankets with a persistent flea. Yet the most striking feature of an important medieval bed was often not the mattress. It was the curtain. Bed curtains created a small chamber within the chamber. Fabric hung around the sleeping space supported by the bed frame or by structures above it. When drawn closed, the curtains reduced air movement around the body. They trapped some of the warmth produced by the sleeper and created a pocket of warmer air. The effect could be significant. A stone room might remain cold enough for breath to show, while the enclosed bed slowly became tolerable beneath wool blankets and heavy covers. This was insulation through textiles once again. The same principle that placed tapestries against walls and cloaks around shoulders surrounded the sleeping body with cloth. Rich beds could display elaborate fabrics, silk, velvet, fine wool embroidery, heraldic designs, and vivid colours appeared in elite households. Inventories sometimes record bed hangings in remarkable detail because of their value. A bed might be described by colour: red, green, blue. A lord could sleep surrounded by visual splendour, while the floor outside remained bitterly cold. For less wealthy castle residents, the solution was simpler. More blankets. Wool was placed over the body in layers. Fur might be used where status and resources permitted. Clothing was not always completely removed, particularly when cold was severe. A cap could remain on the head. A linen garment might stay against the skin. Servants sleeping in less comfortable spaces adapted as best they could. Then there was the oldest source of warmth available, another person. Bed sharing was common in medieval society, though customs depended upon relationship status, age, circumstance, and household organization. Married couples shared beds, children might sleep together, servants, travelers, and people in crowded lodging arrangements could share sleeping spaces. At inns, privacy was not always guaranteed. A pilgrim arriving late on a muddy road might pay for a place in a room where several others already slept. The bed itself could occasionally be shared with strangers according to local practice and available space. Modern ideas of personal sleeping privacy do not fit neatly into the medieval world. Warmth made closeness practical. Two bodies heated an enclosed bed more efficiently than one. Dogs also appear near sleeping spaces in medieval imagery and accounts, though it would be unwise to imagine every castle resident deliberately using animals as bed warmers. Small dogs were particularly associated with elite women in later medieval culture. Still, a living animal near the body produced warmth. The castle cat had other duties, especially where rodents threatened grain and food stores, and probably arranged its sleeping place according to its own opinion. Before anyone climbed into bed, however, the sheets themselves could present a final unpleasant surprise: cold linen. A bed left all day in an unheated chamber gathered the temperature of the room. The first moment beneath the covers might feel almost damp, even when the fabric was dry. This encouraged the use of warming methods. Bed warmers became more familiar in later periods, but various forms of heated pans, stones, bricks, or other warm objects were used across time and place to improve cold sleeping spaces. A metal warming pan containing hot coals could be passed between sheets, though careless use created obvious danger. One spark could damage valuable linen. A coal lost among bedding could do far worse. Servants had to pay attention. Hot stones or bricks wrapped in cloth offered another form of local warmth where such practices were used. Evidence varies, and historians continue to debate the exact frequency of particular methods in different medieval regions. The basic desire needs little explanation. People wanted the bed to feel less like the castle wall. Some folk beliefs surrounded sleep during cold nights. Dreams were taken seriously by many medieval people, although theologians warned that dreams could arise from several sources and should not always be trusted. A dream might be believed to carry divine meaning, reflect bodily conditions, or result from troubling influences. Medical traditions connected dreams with digestion and the humours. Heavy foods might produce disturbed sleep. Cold could also be blamed for illness or weakness. A person waking from a frightening dream in a dark chamber might reach for a cross, recite a prayer, or call softly to someone nearby. Blessed objects were sometimes kept close to beds. A small relic, written prayer, or devotional image offered reassurance. Protective charms also persisted despite church suspicion toward practices considered magical. Night made old fears easier to remember. The chamber beyond the bed curtains was dark. A dying fire clicked in the hearth. Wind moved somewhere in the tower. A shutter shifted. Stone carried sound in strange ways. Footsteps from a distant passage could seem close. Water dripping within a wall might repeat for hours. Some chroniclers claimed particular castles were haunted by the dead, especially where violence had occurred, but such stories often grew long after the supposed events. Those who recorded them never fully agreed on what witnesses actually saw. For a tired servant, the unexplained noise might simply be the building cooling. The bed curtains were drawn more tightly. Outside, the castle settled. Guards remained awake upon the walls. A lantern moved through the courtyard. In the village beyond, houses had gone dark one by one. Moonlight rested on winter fields and on the narrow road leading toward a distant abbey. A bell sounded, then silence returned. Within the chamber, warmth slowly gathered beneath blankets. The sleeper's breath warmed the enclosed air. Cold remained only a few feet away. It waited beside the chest. It covered the stone floor. It rested against the oak door and filled the unlit corners. But the bed had become a smaller world. Curtains surrounded it. Wool covered it. Feathers or straw supported the body. Perhaps another sleeper breathed nearby. For several hours the enormous castle was reduced to the dimensions of a mattress and a curtain. Their warmth could finally be held. Not perfectly, not forever, but long enough for the household to sleep while winter pressed silently against the walls. Long before noble households gathered around fires, someone had to waken the cold and make those fires possible. The servants of a medieval castle experienced winter differently from those they served. A lord might complain that his chamber remained chilly after dawn, but the servant who entered to light the hearth had already crossed several unheated passages, climbed a stone stair and carried wood through a courtyard where frost lay between the paving stones. Warmth began as labour. In the deepest winter that labour often began in darkness. The bells might not yet have marked the first expected duties when lower servants stirred from their sleeping places. Their arrangements varied greatly from castle to castle. Some slept in shared chambers. Others found space near kitchens, storerooms, halls, or workshops. Higher-ranking servants could possess more private accommodation. No one can quite agree how crowded an ordinary servant's sleeping space was across the entire medieval period, because household records usually tell us more about wages and supplies than beds. Yet in a large fortress, privacy was rarely distributed equally. The warmest corners were remembered. So were the coldest. A kitchen worker sleeping near a wall warmed by cooking fires might wake more comfortably than a guard housed beside an outer tower. A stable servant could gain some warmth from animals, although the smell, damp, straw and insects offered their own difficulties. When morning came, sleeping warmth disappeared quickly. Feet met cold floors, wool garments were pulled on, belts were fastened, a hood might remain raised indoors. Then the household began to move. Fire servants and kitchen workers faced the embers first. Ash was shifted with iron tools. Usable coals were separated from cold remains. Dry tinder was brought from protected stores. A careless household could waste fuel. A careful one treated every ember as useful. Wood had already travelled a long way before reaching the hearth. Forest workers cut it. Carts carried it. Labourers stacked it beneath shelters. Someone split the larger pieces. Now a servant selected what the fire needed. Thin sticks first, then slightly heavier wood, then logs. Too much too quickly could smother a weak flame. The skill was ordinary and essential. A young servant learned by watching someone older. Instructions may have been brief. Hands remembered more than words. Across the castle, fires were restored according to priority. The kitchen demanded flame because food preparation could not begin without it. The great hall might need attention before the household gathered. Private chambers of important residents received servants when custom required. Not every room deserved fuel. That decision reflected rank. A storeroom remained cold. An unused chamber remained cold. A minor servant's sleeping space might receive no fire at all. Wood was too valuable to burn for empty stone. Even wealthy households counted fuel. Medieval account rolls sometimes preserve astonishingly detailed purchases and deliveries, although they rarely capture the discomfort hidden behind the numbers. A quantity of firewood on parchment becomes in daily life hours of warmth, divided between many hearths. Someone had to decide where it went. The steward or another household officer supervised supplies. Below such officials, servants carried the weight. Bundles of wood rubbed against shoulders, baskets pressed against arms, splinters caught in gloves or skin. Cold made fingers clumsy. A simple task took longer when joints were stiff. Folk remedies for aching hands were common in later traditions and likely had older roots, though evidence becomes difficult to trace precisely. Salves made with animal fat and herbs could be rubbed into cracked skin. Warm water helped when available. Some believed certain plants possessed particular virtues against cold-related pain. Rue sage and rosemary carried wide reputations in household medicine. Whether a salve truly cured anything was almost secondary when hands were split from work. Relief mattered. After fire came water. A castle required remarkable quantities of it. People drank ale and wine according to status and circumstance, but water remained essential for cooking, washing, cleaning, brewing animals, and countless tasks. Wellsprings, rainwater systems, and cisterns supplied castles depending on their location and design. In winter, access became harder. A bucket lowered into a well returned heavy. The rope might be wet and freezing. Iron fittings bit with cold. Water spilled across stone and created slippery patches. Servants carried vessels carefully through narrow passages. There were no pipes delivering hot water to chambers. To provide warm water, someone heated it. A pot was filled. The pot went over flame. The water warmed. Then it was poured into a jug or basin and carried to whoever had the privilege of receiving it. By the time it arrived, the castle had already begun stealing away its heat. The servant climbed quickly. A noble washing in lukewarm water experienced inconvenience. The servant carrying it had experienced the entire journey. Chambers required further preparation. Curtains might be opened. Bedding could be straightened. Ash was removed. A chamber pot needed emptying. This last task rarely appears in romantic visions of castle life, but winter did not excuse it. Privies existed in many castles, sometimes built as guardrobes projecting from walls or opening into shafts. Yet chamber pots remained practical, especially at night. Their contents had to go somewhere. Servants carried them away. Cold corridors may actually have made the smell slightly less aggressive, one of winter's few modest favours. The observation would not have seemed amusing to the person holding the pot. Floors also needed attention. Rushes were inspected. Dirty material could be removed. Fresh rushes might be spread when supplies and household routines allowed. Sweeping stirred dust fragments of food and ash. In damp weather, mud arrived continuously. Boots crossed the hall. Dogs crossed the hall. Servants crossed it again with brooms. A clean floor was temporary. The household expected effort, not permanence. Stable workers began another kind of cold morning. Horses required feeding and grooming whether snow fell or not. Oats and hay were measured. Water was supplied. Bedding straw was checked. The stable was often warmer than a stone passage because of the animals themselves. Their breath clouded the air. Bodies produced heat. The scent of hay leather manure and horse sweat filled the building. A groom ran a hand along a horse's leg, checking for injury. Travel in winter was hard on animals. Muddy roads strained joints. Frozen ground could become treacherous. Horseshoes required inspection. Some medieval people attached beliefs to horse health that mixed practical knowledge with folklore. Charms might be placed in stables, and particular saints were associated with animals in different regions. Saint Eligius, for example, became connected with horses and metal workers. A groom might respect such devotions. He also respected a loose shoe. Practical knowledge remained immediate. Above the stable roofs, morning finally began to lighten. The castle changed almost imperceptibly. Smoke rose from chimneys. A kitchen door opened. The smell of bread or pottage moved into a passage. Servants crossed one another, carrying bowls, linen, fuel, keys, messages, and water. The cold had not disappeared. It had simply become crowded with work. By the time a lord entered the hall, flames might already be burning. By the time a lady received water, someone had heated it. By the time bread appeared, ovens had been prepared. By the time a clerk sat near a brazier, fuel had been carried. Comfort appeared quietly, often hiding the labour that created it. This was one of the deepest divisions within Castle Winter. Rank influenced not only how warm a person could become, but who performed the work of making warmth. A noble moved toward a prepared fire. A servant built it. A guest received a dry cloak. Someone else hung the wet one. A chamber became slightly less cold because an unseen person had entered it first, and those servants continued long after sunrise. Ash baskets were carried away. Wood stores were checked. Kitchen fires demanded constant attention. A brazier needed fresh coals. An important visitor might arrive unexpectedly, requiring another chamber to be prepared. Nothing stayed warm without effort. By late afternoon, the earlier servants had already spent hours moving between heat and cold. Faces reddened beside flames, then chilled in courtyards. Damp sleeves dried and became damp again. Outside, rain tapped softly against roofs. Mist covered the road beyond the gate. Monastery bells crossed the fields through the grey air. A servant paused beside a doorway with an empty wood basket. For a moment he stood near the hall fire. Perhaps no one noticed. He opened his hands toward the flame, a few breaths, a little heat. Then he lifted the basket and returned to the wood store while behind him, the castle household continued enjoying a warmth that had begun hours earlier in darkness. By the time food reached the tables, the warmth surrounding it had already passed through many hands. A cook had stood beside flame. A kitchen servant had carried water. Someone had hauled wood. Someone had ground grain-cut onions, salted meat, cleaned fish, or stirred a heavy pot while smoke gathered beneath dark rafters. For those who finally sat to eat a hot meal offered something more immediate than display. It offered heat from within. This mattered in a castle where even the grandest chamber could remain cold. The body responded gratefully to warm food. Fingers wrapped around a bowl, steam touched the face. A mouthful of thick pottage carried heat downward into the chest. The comfort was brief. That made it precious. Pottage was among the most familiar foods of medieval life, appearing in countless forms across social ranks. It could be simple or elaborate, thin or thick, made from oats, barley peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage herbs, or whatever ingredients the season and household allowed. In a poor village cottage, pottage might simmer for much of the day over a modest fire. In a castle kitchen, several pots could be prepared for different groups within the household. Rank entered the pot. A lord's table might receive dishes enriched with meat, spices, wine, or costly ingredients. Lower servants might eat simpler fare, yet warm food remained welcome to both. No one can quite agree how often every castle resident received genuinely hot meals, especially in large households where kitchens stood some distance from halls or private chambers. Food cooled quickly while travelling through stone passages. A roasted bird carried across a courtyard in winter did not improve with the journey. Neither did soup. Architects sometimes placed kitchens apart from the main hall because fire was dangerous. Kitchens contained open flames, hot ovens, dry wood grease, and constant activity. A kitchen fire could spread rapidly into timber roofs and adjoining rooms. Separation reduced risk. It also meant servants walked farther with food. Covered dishes helped. Cloths could be wrapped around vessels. Metal or ceramic containers retained some heat. Still, the castle air was always waiting. By the time a dish reached a distant chamber, its steam might already be fading. This was one reason communal eating in the hall carried practical advantages. Many people gathered near the same hearth. Food arrived in larger quantities. Doors still opened and draughts still moved beneath tables, but the concentration of bodies, candles, and fire made the space temporarily more comfortable. The meal became a period of warmth in the middle of a cold day. Bread was nearly always close. Its form depended on grain and status. Fine wheat bread was associated with wealth. Darker loaves made with rye, barley, or mixed grains were common elsewhere. Bread could serve as more than food. Thick slices or flat pieces known as trenchers were sometimes used beneath meat and sauces. After absorbing juices, these trenchers might be eaten, given to servants, distributed to the poor, or fed to animals, depending on household practice. Those who recorded noble feasts sometimes described remarkable quantities of food, but such occasions can distort the medieval world in modern imagination. Most days were not feasts. Most meals did not involve endless roasted swans beneath golden banners. A winter household needed regular food, reliable food, food that could be stored. Salted meat mattered because fresh supplies were seasonal. Pigs were often slaughtered in colder months when preserving meat became easier. Pork could be salted or smoked. Fish was similarly preserved. Herring, cod, and other fish travelled through trade networks in salted or dried form. Religious fasting created enormous demand because church practice restricted meat on many days. The precise rules and their observance varied by place and period, and historians continue to debate how ordinary people interpreted certain restrictions. Castle kitchens, however, were accustomed to planning around the calendar. A fast day changed the menu. A saint's feast could change it again. Lent reshaped entire weeks. The bells of the church did not merely organize prayer, they entered the kitchen. Fish appeared where meat had been. Almond milk might be used in wealthier cookery as an alternative ingredient during fasting periods. Ground almonds mixed with water or other liquids produced a pale preparation used in sauces and dishes. This sounds luxurious because almonds were costly in many northern regions. For an elite kitchen, however, religious restrictions could encourage remarkable culinary creativity. Spices also transformed food. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, mace, nutmeg, and saffron reached European markets through long trade routes. They were expensive and therefore strongly connected with status. A noble household might use spices generously when receiving guests. Their presence communicated wealth. But spices also entered medieval medical thinking. Under humoral theories, foods possessed qualities associated with heat, cold, dryness, or moisture. Certain spices were considered warming. Ginger, for instance, could be valued not only for flavor, but for its perceived effects on the body. A winter dish seasoned heavily might therefore seem suitable in more than one sense. The cook created flavor. The physician's tradition provided an explanation. The diner felt warm. These worlds overlapped naturally. Hot drinks provided another comfort, though the exact habits surrounding them differed across centuries and regions. Wine could be warmed and spiced. Ale might be heated in some circumstances. Later traditions preserve many recipes for mulled drinks, but it would be careless to place the same recipe in every medieval castle. Still warmed and spiced beverages were known. A cup held close to the hands was valuable before it reached the mouth. Metal cups, wooden vessels, pottery and glass all appeared according to status and use. Fine tableware could display rank, but even a plain cup carried warmth. There were remedies disguised as drinks as well. Herbs steeped in liquid might be offered for coughs, chills, or weakness. Honey could sweeten preparations where available. Sage enjoyed a particularly broad medicinal reputation. Some households trusted mixtures of wine herbs and spices. Others relied upon recipes passed through generations. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed on which remedies worked. The patient often had no desire to wait for agreement. A hot drink was accepted. Outside the kitchen, the castle winter continued. Rain darkened the courtyard stones. A cart approached the gate carrying sacks of grain, and a barrel whose iron hoops were slick with water. The driver had travelled along a muddy road past bare hedges and a roadside shrine marked by a weathered cross. At the gate, a toll or payment might be recorded depending on local arrangements. Goods entered. Supplies became meals. The network feeding a castle extended far beyond its walls. Farmers grew grain. Millers ground it. Fishermen caught fish. Salt workers produced preservation materials. Merchants moved spices. Peasants supplied rents or dues in produce. Castle warmth at the table rested upon labour scattered across the countryside. The hall rarely paused to consider all of it. A steward worried about quantities. A cook worried about timing. A servant worried about dropping the dish. The diners ate. For a while, conversation moved more easily. A fire burned nearby. The smell of roasted meat, bread, onions, and smoke filled the hall. Dogs waited beneath tables for scraps. A spoon scraped the inside of a bowl. Someone broke bread. Someone asked for more ale. Warm food softened the cold, not completely. Beneath the table, feet still chilled. A draught entered when the door opened. A person seated too far from the hearth might keep a cloak around the shoulders, but the body had fuel now. That mattered. After the meal, leftovers were handled carefully. Food represented expense. Bones could flavour broth. Stale bread might be reused. Fat was valuable. Kitchen scraps could feed animals. In a large household, waste existed, especially during displays of wealth, but practical reuse remained part of everyday management. Some food went to the poor. Almsgiving held religious importance, and noble or monastic households could distribute bread or other provisions according to custom. Feast days and religious obligations sometimes encouraged greater generosity. A beggar waiting near a castle gate understood the value of hot food differently from those inside. A bowl of pottage was not atmosphere, it was survival. Evening slowly approached. In the kitchen, the hottest fires remained active. Copper and iron vessels reflected flame. Steam gathered briefly before disappearing into smoky air. A cook tasted a sauce. A servant carried bread toward the hall. Beyond the walls, mist settled over winter fields. The village church bell marked another hour. Smoke rose from small houses and from the greater chimneys of the castle alike. For one quiet moment, noble hall and peasant cottage shared the same simple hope. That the fire would hold, that the pot would remain warm, that there would be enough food until morning. Inside the castle, bowls were set down once more. Hands moved toward them. Steam rose into the cold air, and winter, which had filled the walls and corridors all day, retreated for the length of a meal. The warmth of a meal could follow a person only so far. Eventually the hall emptied again. Bowls were cleared. Benches stood in rows beneath dim light. Some servants returned to work while others prepared for the next call of bells. The chapel waited. In many castles, religious life was woven into the household, rather than placed at a comfortable distance from it. A lord might maintain a private chapel within the fortress. Larger residences could employ chaplains, clerks, and other religious servants. Smaller strongholds might depend upon a nearby parish priest or monastery. Whatever the arrangement, prayer did not stop because the stone floor was cold. Morning worship could be particularly severe in winter. A chapel rarely possessed the roaring fire of a great hall. Fire near valuable cloth Wooden furnishings, wax books, and sacred objects created risks. Some religious spaces had forms of heating nearby or benefited from adjacent rooms, but many remained cold. Very cold. The same masonry that chilled the castle walls surrounded the altar. Windows admitted weak winter light. Stone paving drew warmth from shoes. A person kneeling for prayer could feel the cold almost immediately. No one can quite agree how often medieval worshippers remained physically uncomfortable throughout services because the records usually preserve prayers, endowments, furnishings, and religious obligations rather than complaints about frozen knees, yet the architecture speaks quietly. And so do household purchases of wool fur gloves and fuel elsewhere. A chapel built inside a castle did not escape the climate simply because it was sacred. Before dawn, a chaplain might rise and dress while the corridors remained dark. He wore linen and wool beneath vestments. Depending upon his office and the ceremony, further layers followed. Religious clothing was rich in symbolism. It was also clothing. A wool garment still offered warmth. The priest or chaplain prepared sacred vessels books in the altar. Candles were checked. Beeswax was particularly valued for religious use because it burned more cleanly than tallow and carried symbolic associations with purity. Wax candles could be expensive. Their number mattered. A wealthy chapel might glow with several flames during an important feast. On an ordinary winter morning, the light could be much more restrained. The first candle did almost nothing to warm the room. Its flame stood small against hundreds of tons of stone, yet it gave shape to the darkness. A crucifix emerged above the altar. The edges of a painted image became visible. Metal reflected a point of gold. A priest opened a book. Manuscripts themselves disliked cold and damp. Parchment responded to changes in moisture. Bindings suffered. Ink and painted decoration required care. Valuable service books could be kept in protected chests or cupboards when not in use. A chapel servant handling such a book washed or cleaned his hands according to household and religious practice. Then the pages were opened cautiously. The words waited where generations had placed them. Outside, a bell sounded. Bells were among the most powerful instruments of medieval life. They marked prayer. They warned of danger. They announced death. They celebrated. They travelled farther than the human voice. A castle bell could call members of the household. A monastery bell in the valley might organise the entire day of a religious community. Parish bells reached farmers working in fields and women standing beside village ovens. Time was heard. This was especially important in a world where few individuals possessed anything resembling a personal clock. The hour belonged to the bell. Its sound crossed weather. On a clear morning it travelled far. In mist the sound seemed closer and stranger. During storms it could vanish beneath wind. Some medieval communities believed bells did more than summon people. Blessed church bells were sometimes thought capable of driving away evil influences or protecting against storms. Inscriptions on bells could call upon saints or divine protection. The exact beliefs differed greatly. Church teaching, local custom, and older folklore mixed in complicated ways. Some chroniclers claimed bells were rung against dangerous weather. Others described them during moments of fear or disaster. Even now, historians continue to debate how ordinary villagers understood such practices. A monk might explain the bell through prayer. A farmer might say the sound frightened demons from the clouds. The bell rang either way. In the castle chapel, members of the household arrived gradually. The lord and family might occupy places reflecting their status. Servants stood elsewhere. Seating was limited in many medieval religious spaces, and worship often involved standing or kneeling. This made winter harder. A person seated on a wooden bench at least had some separation from stone. A person kneeling directly upon the floor had less. Cushions could be used by wealthy worshippers. Textiles might soften particular spaces. But devotion demanded physical participation. Bodies bowed, hands joined, knees bent. The cold became part of the posture. There were beliefs strongly rooted in medieval religious culture that bodily discomfort could possess spiritual value. Fasting, long prayer, pilgrimage, and voluntary hardship might be understood as forms of discipline or devotion. Monks and hermits were praised in stories for enduring severe conditions. Saints slept on hard surfaces. Holy men rejected luxury. The reality of ordinary religious life was usually less dramatic, but the ideal mattered. A cold chapel could therefore be interpreted in ways unfamiliar to modern visitors. Discomfort was not automatically considered a failure of the building. It might simply be endured. A nobleman who demanded the finest food in his hall could still kneel in a cold chapel because the purpose of the room was different. Warmth belonged to comfort. The chapel was concerned with eternity. Nearby monasteries lived even more directly according to bells and prayer. A monk might leave a dormitory during the darkness for the night offices. Medieval monastic practice varied by order and period, but the rhythm could require prayer at hours when the rest of the countryside slept. The cloister was cold. The church was colder. Stone corridors offered little protection from frost. Monks wore wool habits and additional garments according to rules and local custom. Some houses permitted fur or lined clothing in severe climates. Others maintained stricter ideals. Rules existed. Human beings still shivered. There are records of monasteries providing warming rooms, sometimes called calefactories, where monks could spend limited time near a fire. These rooms were especially important in cold regions. The very existence of such spaces reveals how unusual general warmth could be. One heated room was worth naming. Monks might warm hands there. Ink work could be easier. Clothing could dry. Then the bell called again. The warmth was left behind. Castle chapels and abbeys were linked through more than prayer. Noble families founded monasteries. They donated land. They requested prayers for the dead. They gave wax vessels, cloth, or money. A lord might ask monks to remember his parents at the altar. A lady might fund candles to burn before an image of a saint. Such candles carried practical and spiritual value. Wax became light. Light became devotion. The cold darkness of winter made that symbolism stronger. Relics also drew attention. A castle chapel might possess a small relic connected with a saint, while great abbeys guarded collections that attracted pilgrims from long distances. Pilgrims travelled roads in all seasons. Winter reduced their numbers, but devotion did not always wait for spring. A traveller approached a shrine wearing a wool cloak darkened by rain. Mud covered his shoes. A pilgrim badge might already be fastened to his hat from an earlier journey. He carried bread, perhaps dried fish, perhaps a small flask. Roadside crosses and shrines offered moments for prayer. Abbey guest houses could provide shelter. The promise of a roof became especially welcome as evening cold descended. Within castle walls, the household knew these journeys through stories. Someone had visited Canterbury. Someone had travelled to Rome. Someone knew a knight who went to Santiago. Pilgrimage connected the cold chapel to distant roads. At the altar, the same saints were named. The same wax burned. The same bells marked time. Morning prayer ended slowly. There was no sudden release into warmth. People rose, knees stiffened, hands disappeared into sleeves. The Lord returned toward private rooms. Servants moved toward their duties. The chaplain remained behind briefly. A candle was extinguished. A thin thread of smoke rose from the wick. Outside the chapel, daylight had finally reached the courtyard. Frost remained in shaded corners. A guard crossed beneath the walls. From beyond the gate came the distant sound of another bell, perhaps, from an abbey hidden behind bare trees and winter mist. Its voice travelled over frozen fields. One bell answered another. And throughout the medieval landscape in castles, monasteries, villages, and stone churches, people entered cold sacred spaces because prayer, like winter, followed its own rhythm. The floors remained hard. The walls remained damp. The candles gave more light than heat. Still the bells continued. And when their sound faded into the grey morning, the castle household returned to its ordinary labours, carrying with it the chill of the chapel and the quiet certainty that before long the bell would call again. The bells might call everyone toward the same chapel, but the castle did not distribute warmth so evenly. Some rooms were simply better than others. They faced the sun. They stood above kitchens. They possessed fireplaces. They had fewer outer walls. They were smaller, lower, and easier to heat. And almost without exception, the people who enjoyed such spaces were those with enough rank to claim them. Warmth became a form of privilege. A lord rarely lived every hour of the day in the great hall. The hall was useful for public life, meals, ceremonies, receiving visitors, and displaying authority. But when business ended, the most important members of the household could withdraw. The private chamber offered relief. One such space was often called a solar, although the term changed in meaning across centuries and regions. A solar was generally a more private upper chamber, associated with the lord's family or other high-status occupants. Its name may suggest sunlight, and some solars did benefit from better light, but historians continue to debate the precise origins and uses of the term in different periods. What mattered in winter was size. A private room was easier to warm than a great hall. The ceiling could be lower. The doors opened less frequently. Fewer servants passed through. A fireplace, if one existed, served a smaller volume of air. Textiles covered walls. Beds, chests, benches, cushions, and other furniture filled the space, making it feel less exposed than an empty stone chamber. The difference could be immediate. A person leaving the hall and entering a well-appointed solar might pass through a heavy curtain and feel the air become calmer. Not necessarily warm, but calmer. The draught disappeared. The fire was closer. A fur-lined mantle suddenly seemed more effective. The room itself cooperated. This was a luxury. The lower servants rarely had spaces that cooperated with them. They slept and worked where the household required. A kitchen worker might find heat beside the ovens, but that warmth came with labour. A stable hand shared warmth with animals, but also damp straw and constant responsibility. The noble family could sit near a private hearth without stirring a pot. That distinction mattered. In the Lord's chamber, firewood might be supplied regularly. Logs arrived according to household routine. Ash was cleared. Servants kept the hearth ready. A visitor of sufficient status could expect similar treatment. Preparing a chamber for an important guest was a serious task. The bed was arranged. Hangings were inspected. Fresh rushes might be spread. Candles were provided. A fire was built before the guest entered. This last detail revealed wealth without needing a single golden cup. To burn wood in an empty room merely so that someone might later find it comfortable required resources. A poor household could hardly imagine such waste. A great lord could order it. Hospitality was deeply connected with status. A nobleman judged another nobleman partly through the treatment received under his roof. Food mattered. Wine mattered. The quality of the bed mattered. And on a freezing evening, the warmth of the chamber mattered. No one can quite agree how frequently guests formally complained about poor heating, because politeness and political caution shaped surviving letters. A man seeking favour was unlikely to begin his message by describing his host's miserable fireplace, but household officers understood expectations. An honoured guest should not be placed beside a leaking shutter if another room stood available. Rank could be mapped across the castle through temperature. Near the upper end of the hall, closest to the Lord's table, conditions might be slightly better. Within the private solar, better again. The Lord's sleeping chamber received textiles and fuel. A lesser clerk might work in a cold room. A guard stood outside. Beyond the walls, a villager gathered fallen branches under customary woodland rites. Everyone experienced the same winter. They did not experience the same protection from it. Tapestries made the distinction particularly visible. The finest examples required enormous labour. Wool and sometimes silk threads were dyed and woven into detailed scenes. Workshops produced images of hunts, gardens, battles, biblical stories, noble entertainments, and fantastical creatures. A great tapestry could cost a fortune. It also covered a cold wall. Textiles softened the appearance of masonry and reduced the uncomfortable sensation of sitting near bare stone. They interrupted drafts and created pockets of still air. Rich households moved tapestries between residences. This may seem surprising until one remembers that medieval courts could be highly mobile. Kings and great lords travelled, households followed. Furniture, clothing, documents, kitchen equipment, and textiles moved with them. A castle did not always remain fully furnished throughout the year. Rooms were dressed when important residents arrived. Walls that had stood bare through months of cold suddenly received hangings. Beds appeared. Cushions were unpacked. Chests were carried upstairs. Fireplaces were lit. The castle became inhabited through objects. And when the household departed, some of that comfort left again. Worn wooden furniture also contributed quietly to the sense of warmth. A bench covered with a cushion felt different from bare stone. A high-backed chair reduced draughts against the body. Footstools lifted feet from cold floors. Carpets were not used everywhere in the familiar modern manner, but valuable woven textiles could cover tables, benches, chests, or selected surfaces. Even a wooden platform beneath a bed offered separation from stone. Comfort accumulated in layers: a cushion, a hanging, a rug, a screen, a fire, a cloak. Each solved only part of the problem. Together they created privilege. Private rooms also allowed habits that would have been difficult in the crowded hall. A lady might sew beside a window while daylight lasted. A clerk could read aloud. Children of noble families received instruction. A chaplain might discuss a religious text. A musician could play softly. Conversation changed when fewer people listened. The castle became intimate. On a winter evening, members of the Lord's family might gather near the private fire rather than remain in the hall. Wax candles burned. A servant brought warmed wine. A small dog slept upon a cushion. Outside, the wind crossed the battlements. The contrast was powerful. Some medieval people believed physical surroundings influenced the balance of the body. Physicians following humoral traditions considered warmth especially important for certain conditions, ages, and temperaments. The elderly might be advised to seek warmer environments. Ill people could be moved closer to fires. Foods thought to possess warming qualities might be recommended. Spices, wine, and particular meats entered these theories. A wealthy person could follow such advice far more easily than a labourer. If a physician said the patient required warmth, servants brought wood. If an old kitchen worker suffered aching joints, she continued working beside whichever fire belonged to the kitchen. Medical theory did not erase rank. It sometimes emphasized it. There were also unusual protective practices surrounding private chambers. Blessed candles might be lit during storms. Relics could be kept near beds. Crosses were marked above doorways. Herbs or fragrant branches might be hung in rooms. Some people used written charms against illness fever or evil influences. Church authorities repeatedly warned against superstitious practices, especially those involving unknown words or magical formulas. Yet such objects continued to appear. A cold chamber at midnight encouraged caution. A warm private room encouraged confidence. The difference between the two was not only physical. Warmth made a place feel controlled. The fire obeyed. The curtains stayed still. The door remained closed. Winter existed outside the walls. For a few hours, wealth created the illusion that it had been defeated. But even privileged rooms had limits. The fire needed feeding. Smoke sometimes entered the chamber. The chimney could draw badly. A servant opening the door admitted a rush of cold air. Water in a basin cooled. The corners remained chilly. A tapestry hid the stone but did not transform it, and when everyone finally went to bed, the fire sank lower. The castle began reclaiming the room. Late at night, only a few lights remained. A guard walked the wall beneath a hard sky. In the courtyard, frost formed again on stone. Beyond the gate, a narrow road disappeared into mist. The manor houses, village cottages, and abbey buildings of the surrounding countryside settled into darkness. Inside the private solar, one final log shifted in the hearth. Sparks rose. A fur-lined cloak rested across a chair. Heavy curtains enclosed the bed. For the lord's family, winter had been pushed several feet away. For the servant sleeping near an unheated passage, it lay directly beside the blanket. The same castle held both lives. The same bells marked their hours. The same wind moved around the towers, but warmth like fine cloth, good food, and private space followed rank wherever it could. Beyond the castle walls, winter did not become kinder. It simply changed shape. The villages, manor houses, abbeys, roadside inns, and scattered shelters that lay across the medieval countryside experienced the cold in different ways. A fortress might trap winter within thick stone, but a timber cottage allowed the season to press close through thinner walls, low roofs and doors that opened directly onto mud. Yet sometimes, strangely, the smaller building felt warmer. A village house could be modest enough for a single fire to influence most of the interior. Its ceiling was lower. The walls enclosed less air. Cooking, sleeping, mending, and conversation often happened within the same limited space. People gathered close. In some households, animals occupied part of the same building or stood in an adjoining section. Cattle, goats, and other livestock produced body heat, though the precise arrangement varied widely by region and period. Historians continue to debate how common particular house plans were across medieval Europe, because a village in England could differ greatly from one in the Alps or northern Italy. Still, where animals remained, close warmth came with smells: hay, manure, wet wool, smoke, stored onions, the earthy scent of damp clothing drying beside a fire. It was not the scented chamber of a noble solar, but the room could feel less empty. A castle corridor had stone air and silence. A cottage had bodies. Someone stirred a pot. Someone repaired a shoe. A child might have been present in ordinary medieval households, though noble and peasant family arrangements differed, and mortality shaped family life in ways modern people can find difficult to imagine. At night, everyone drew closer to the hearth. The fire might be small because fuel was limited. Peasants depended upon customary rites, purchased fuel peat in some regions, brushwood, or gathered material. Forest law could restrict access to valuable timber. A fallen branch was not always free simply because it lay beneath a tree. Custom decided who could collect it. The lord's rights mattered. The villager remembered the boundaries. Those who violated woodland regulations could face fines in manorial courts. A winter fire therefore contained law as surely as flame. In villages near castles, people watched smoke rising from fortress chimneys and may have imagined abundant warmth above the walls. Those inside the fortress might have looked down at low cottages and imagined miserable poverty. Both images could be correct. Both could also be misleading. A poor cottage offered little protection from hunger or severe weather. Thatch leaked, timber decayed, earthen floors became damp, bedding was simple. But a small room crowded around one cooking fire could sometimes feel warmer than an enormous noble hall. Rank improved blankets. It did not alter the movement of warm air. Manor houses occupied a world between cottage and castle. Some were built partly of stone, others relied heavily upon timber. A prosperous manor might contain a hall, private chambers, storerooms, service buildings, and a chapel or nearby church. It lacked the great defensive walls of a castle. This could be an advantage against cold. Walls did not need to be several feet thick. Windows could become larger where security allowed. Rooms could be arranged with domestic life more firmly in mind. The lord of the manor still faced draughts and smoky fires, but the building existed to manage an estate and house, a household rather than resist siege. Worn wooden furniture gathered around the hall. A long table stood on trestles. Chests lined walls. Rushes covered floors. A steward received tenants bringing rents or payments in produce. Winter dues might arrive as grain, poultry, or other goods according to local custom. A tenant waiting near the door remained cold. The steward near the hearth did slightly better. Hierarchy followed fire even without battlements. Monasteries created another kind of winter world. Their buildings often included stone churches, cloisters, dormitories, refectories, kitchens, workshops, guest houses, and storerooms. The scale depended upon the wealth and importance of the house. Some great abbeys possessed vast lands. Smaller communities survived more modestly. The religious routine continued through the cold. Bells called monks from one duty to another. Prayer interrupted sleep. Work interrupted prayer. Meals followed rules. Silence was observed according to the customs of particular orders. The warming room where one existed became unusually valuable. A calefactory offered fire in a community where many rooms remained deliberately or practically unheated. Monks could warm themselves for limited periods, sometimes according to rule or local discipline. A scribe with stiff fingers welcomed the heat. A brother responsible for the infirmary might warm medicines. Clothing could dry. Then someone left the room and crossed the cloister. The cold returned immediately. The covered walkway protected against rain. It did not stop winter air. Monks sometimes used hand warmers or heated objects in later medieval practice, though evidence differs across communities. Fingerless gloves or other practical adaptations could help with writing and work. A manuscript page required steady hands. The saint in the illuminated initial did not care whether the scribe's fingers were numb. The scribe certainly did. Abbey infirmaries tried to provide greater comfort for the sick. Medical herbs grew in gardens where climate permitted. Sage fennel, rue mint, and other plants appeared in monastic medicine. Dried herbs survived the winter in stores. Remedies might be prepared with wine, honey fat, or water. Some treatments reflected learned medicine. Others relied upon local tradition. A monk suffering from chills could be wrapped in blankets and moved nearer a fire if the infirmary possessed one. Prayer accompanied treatment. A relic might be invoked. No one can quite agree how often monks themselves believed miraculous aid would replace ordinary remedies. Medieval religious life did not always separate medicine and prayer as sharply as later observers sometimes do. A warm drink and a saint's intercession could be requested on the same evening. Beyond abbey gates, roads carried other winter lives. Pilgrims moved between shrines. Merchants travelled toward market towns. Messengers rode between castles. Clergy crossed parishes. Labourers searched for work. The medieval road was often not a paved highway, but a changing line through landscape. Rain transformed it. Wagon wheels cut deep channels. Hooves churned earth. Mud gathered around ankles and clung to hems. A traveller might leave a village in the morning with dry shoes and arrive at an inn appearing to have borrowed half the road. There was little dignity in deep mud, only progress. Pilgrims carried staffs, bags, cloaks, and sometimes badges marking earlier shrine visits. A broad-brimmed hat offered protection against rain. The scallop shell became strongly associated with pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Other shrines produced their own badges, often made from inexpensive metals and sold near holy sites. These small objects served as souvenir signs of devotion and perhaps protection in the minds of some wearers. A pilgrim touched the badge beneath his cloak. Wind moved through bare branches. The road continued. Roadside shrines appeared in various forms: a cross, a small image of a saint, a niche built into a wall. Travellers paused, some left small offerings, others simply crossed themselves and walked onward. Danger did not disappear because the journey was holy. Roads could be lonely, bridges failed, rivers rose. Wolves occupied a powerful place in medieval fears and stories, though the actual risk varied by location. Human robbery was often a more practical concern. Night presented the greatest urgency. Shelter had to be found. An abbey guest house offered one possibility. Hospitality to travellers and pilgrims formed part of Christian practice, though monasteries differed in the resources they could provide. A guest might receive bread ale pottage or simple lodging. The room could be shared. The bed could be hard. It was still a roof. Roadside inns provided another choice. The romantic inn of later stories glowing warmly beside a perfect road should be imagined with caution. A medieval inn might be crowded, smoky, damp and noisy. Horses stood nearby. Travellers carried mud indoors. Beds could be shared. Fleas paid no toll at the entrance, but the fire was real. That was enough. A pilgrim entered and removed a wet cloak. The innkeeper judged the new arrival quickly. Could he pay? Did he travel alone? Did he carry goods? Was he likely to cause trouble? Ale arrived. Perhaps bread and cheese. Perhaps a bowl from the cooking pot. The traveller's shoes rested near the fire, not too close. Leather hardened and cracked when treated badly. Other guests spoke quietly. A merchant complained about the road. A man from another county described snow farther north. Someone mentioned a bridge damaged by rain. Those who recorded medieval journeys never fully agreed on conditions because travel was unpredictable. One day might pass easily. The next required hours to cover only a few miles. Outside rain fell on the inn roof. Far away a monastery bell sounded through the darkness. The fire settled lower. Travellers wrapped themselves in cloaks and blankets. Some slept on beds. Others took whatever place remained. In the castle a lord slept behind heavy curtains. In the manor house the steward checked tomorrow's accounts. In the village a family lay close beneath wool coverings. In the abbey monks waited for the next bell. Across the countryside, people endured the same season within very different walls. Stone was not always colder because it was poor. Timber was not always warmer because it was simple. The body noticed size, air dampness, wind, fire, and company more readily than status. A small cottage could hold warmth. A great castle could lose it. A crowded inn could become almost comfortable. A monastery warming room could feel luxurious for 20 quiet minutes. And along the muddy road between them the traveller carried his own shelter in wool, leather and patience. The medieval landscape settled into night. Watchfires glowed on distant walls. Smoke rose from village roofs. Moonlight touched the stone of an abbey church. A road vanished beneath mist. Somewhere upon it, another traveller was still walking toward a light in the distance, hoping that behind whichever door finally opened, there would be a little bread, a dry corner, and a fire not yet gone out. The traveller approaching that distant light might have found in a newer residence something quietly different. The room beyond the door could be smaller. The window might hold glass. The fireplace might draw smoke upward with greater confidence. None of these changes arrived at once, and no mason woke one morning having invented the comfortable castle. Medieval architecture changed slowly, unevenly, and often only when wealth, fashion, war, or necessity allowed rebuilding. A fortress was expensive. Once walls stood, people tended to use them. A lord might inherit a tower raised by his grandfather and discover that its narrow chambers were dark, smoky, and cold. He could complain. He could hang more cloth. He could order another brazier. Rebuilding several feet of stone was another matter, so comfort entered castles through additions. A window was altered. A chimney was inserted. A timber partition divided a room. A new chamber rose against an older wall. The medieval castle adapted piece by piece. Chimneys were among the most important changes. Earlier open hearths had allowed smoke to rise into roof spaces and escape through vents. Wall fireplaces connected to flues offered a more controlled path upward. The principle seems simple now. Building one well was not. A chimney flue had to draw smoke. Its dimensions mattered. The height mattered. The position relative to roofs and wind mattered. Poorly designed fireplaces smoked. A servant could spend an hour coaxing a flame only to watch the room fill with grey haze when the wind shifted. Masons learned through experience. Over generations, fireplaces became more common in private chambers and important rooms. They could be built into exterior walls with the flue rising inside or against the masonry. Some castles display rows of chimney stacks that belong to later periods of improvement. From outside, these stacks reveal a change in priorities. The fortress still needed defence. Its inhabitants also wanted more rooms with fires. No one can quite agree on exactly when comfort became a major architectural concern across all medieval castles, because there was no single transformation. Royal residences often changed earlier or more dramatically than remote strongholds. Southern climates created different needs from northern ones, but the direction is visible. Domestic life began asking more from stone. A room was no longer expected merely to be secure. It might also be expected to be pleasant. Windows changed as well. Glass remained expensive, particularly when produced in the quantities required for larger openings. Yet improvements in craft and expanding wealth allowed glazed windows to appear more widely in elite buildings. Small panes were joined with lead. The resulting windows did not resemble the broad, perfectly sealed sheets of modern houses. They still allowed draughts. Lead weakened. Glass broke. But a glazed window offered something remarkable. Light without an entirely open hole. A shutter could remain open. The winter sun could enter. Wind was reduced. For a person sewing, reading, writing accounts, or simply sitting near the window, the difference mattered. Window seats became natural places for work. Deep castle walls created recesses around windows, and benches could be built into these spaces. A lady might sit there with embroidery. A clerk might unfold a document. A servant could mend linen when permitted. The light was strongest near the glass. The cold was often strongest there too. People balanced one need against another. Cushions helped. Fur helped. A small footstool helped. The body learned to negotiate architecture as it always had. Greater use of glass also altered the appearance of castles from outside. At dusk, lit chambers could glow through windows. A traveller on a winter road saw squares of gold in a dark wall. The castle appeared warmer than it truly was. Perhaps this is where part of the later myth began. Light looks like warmth. The two are easily confused from a distance. Inside, candles and hearths produced a beautiful scene, while someone still complained about cold feet. Wall hangings became increasingly important in wealthy interiors. The finest tapestries travelled through noble households as treasures. Their decorative value was obvious, but their practical usefulness remained significant. A tapestry interrupted the cold presence of stone. It softened echoes. It reduced drafts along some walls. It transformed a severe room into an inhabited one. Scenes of green forests covered grey masonry. Nights hunted beneath woven trees while real winter stripped the woods outside. Gardens bloomed in thread during January. Animals wandered through imagined landscapes. Colour itself may have offered psychological warmth. The stone disappeared. This mattered more than it sounds. A room feels different when the eye no longer meets bare wall. Medieval people understood atmosphere even when they did not use modern language for it. They scattered herbs among rushes. They burned scented materials. They displayed bright cloth. They painted beams. They decorated chests. The idea that castle inhabitants simply accepted ugliness belongs more to careless modern imagination than to medieval life. Those who could afford beauty wanted it. Those who could afford warmth wanted that too. Textiles sometimes served as movable partitions. Curtains could divide sleeping areas or shield doorways. Wooden screens broke up large spaces. Permanent timber partitions created smaller chambers within greater buildings. This movement toward enclosed rooms changed the experience of castle living. The great hall remained important, but the household no longer needed to spend every private hour within it. A lord could withdraw. A lady could receive companions. Children could be taught away from the public noise. Accounts could be checked in a chamber where documents were less exposed to smoke and spilled ale. Smaller rooms held heat better. The improvement was almost accidental at first. Privacy and warmth desired the same architecture. More doors, more partitions, less open air. A fire serving one chamber became more effective than a hearth, attempting to warm a hall filled with rising smoke and constant traffic. Furniture followed these changes. Tables could remain in particular rooms rather than being set up only when required. Cupboards and presses stored textiles. Beds became elaborate structures with permanent hangings. Chairs, benches, stools, and chests filled spaces that had once felt sparse. A furnished room held daily life close. People left objects where they expected to use them again. A prayer book rested in a chest. A spindle waited near a window. A writing box remained near a clerk's table. A pair of gloves dried beside a hearth. These simple objects suggest a gradual transformation. The castle was becoming more of a home. Comfort was still uneven. Cold passages connected warmer chambers. Servants continued carrying enormous quantities of fuel. A glazed window could crack during bad weather. Chimney fires remained dangerous. Soot accumulated within flues and needed attention. One lesser-known danger of improved fireplaces was precisely this build-up of soot and tar-like deposits. Medieval people did not have organised chimney-sweeping industries in every place and period, but flues still required cleaning. Someone climbed, someone scraped, someone became very dirty. Neglected chimneys could catch fire. A flame rising within a flue threatened roof timbers and nearby structures. Protective prayers might be spoken. Saints might be invoked. The practical response remained water tools and frightened servants. Progress carried new problems. Glazed windows required craftsmen. Chimneys required maintenance. Tapestries attracted dust and insects. Wooden partitions increased fire risk. A more comfortable castle was also a more complicated castle. Yet people continued improving them. That persistence reveals something important. Medieval society did not remain frozen in one architectural moment. The 13th century was not the 15th. A castle built for a warrior lord could later become a noble residence. Battlements remained while larger windows appeared. Old arrow slits looked out beside decorative chambers. Defensive towers gained fireplaces. A place designed to resist enemies slowly learned to resist winter. Not completely, never completely, but enough to change expectations. A noble born into a castle with several heated private rooms might regard an earlier smoky hall as primitive. Comfort creates memory quickly. What one generation calls luxury, the next begins to call ordinary. Outside evening settled across the countryside. Rain passed softly over roofs. The road shone beneath fading light. At an abbey bells marked the hour. In a newer chamber behind the castle wall, a glazed window reflected firelight. A curtain hung across the doorway. Tapestries covered the stone. A woman folded embroidery and placed it within a chest. A servant added one log to the hearth. The chimney drew the smoke upward. For once the room did not fill with it. The servant closed the door. The fire settled. The winter night remained beyond the glass. Inside, warmth stayed a little longer than it once had. And in that small change repeated across chambers, generations, and rebuilding campaigns, the medieval castle slowly began to become a place not only endured, but lived in with growing expectations of comfort. The warmer chamber with its glazed window and well-drawing chimney is perhaps the place where modern imagination prefers to remain. It is easy to picture the medieval castle this way. Firelight on stone, candles along a table, heavy curtains, bright tapestries, a silver cup beside a carved chair. Outside, snow falls quietly across towers and battlements, while everyone within sits beneath fur-lined cloaks and listens to music. The image is not entirely false. That is what makes it so convincing. There were roaring fires, there were candlelit halls, there were tapestries rich with colour and tables crowded with food. Musicians performed in noble households. Winter feasts brought people together. Great beds stood behind embroidered curtains, but all of these comforts existed within a colder world. The fire burned because the room needed it. The curtains hung because the walls were unpleasant. The fur was worn because the air remained chilly. The great bed enclosed its sleeper because the chamber beyond was difficult to warm. Modern images often preserve the solution while forgetting the problem. A painting of a noble feast shows the flames. It does not show the servant who carried the wood. An illuminated manuscript might depict a lord beside a decorated hearth. It rarely records the draught beneath the door. A surviving tapestry appears luxurious in a museum. Placed against a castle wall in January, it was also a practical barrier between a human body and cold masonry. The cosy medieval castle is therefore a kind of half-memory. Its details are true. Their meaning has shifted. No one can quite agree on when popular culture began turning castles into reliably comfortable winter homes. Romantic literature, later historical paintings, stage traditions, and modern films all played a part. Each generation inherited certain images and polished them a little further. The fireplace grew larger, the candles multiplied. The snow outside became prettier, the damp disappeared. Smoke disappeared too. So did the smell of wet wool. The floor rushes became permanently fresh. The dogs beneath the table became charming companions rather than animals that occasionally brought mud indoors. History became tidier. Castles, of course, invite this treatment. Their ruins are dramatic. A broken tower on a hill appears mysterious at sunset. Ivy softens cracked walls. Empty windows frame the sky. Visitors walk across courtyards where no kitchen waste remains and no servant is hauling water. The building has become silent. Silence makes discomfort difficult to imagine. A modern visitor often arrives wearing weatherproof shoes and a warm coat. The visit lasts perhaps 2 hours. Afterwards there is a car, a train, a cafe, or a heated room. The medieval resident stayed. That difference changes everything. One cold afternoon in a castle can feel atmospheric. 4 months of cold mornings become a way of life. The same stair must be climbed every day. The same shutter must be opened. The same damp corner remains damp. The same hearth must be relit. Romance enjoys the first snowfall. Household management thinks about the woodpile. This does not mean medieval people lived in constant misery. Such an idea would be another distortion. Human beings adapt quickly to familiar conditions. A person raised in a castle did not spend every winter morning comparing the room with a modern heated bedroom. There was no such comparison to make. Cold was expected. Winter was expected. Wool clothing was normal. Sitting near a fire was normal. Sleeping behind curtains was normal. A servant warming a basin of water did not think he was participating in an unusual historical experience. He was working. A lady pulling fur around her shoulders was not creating a picturesque scene. She was cold. The ordinary nature of these habits makes them easy to misunderstand centuries later. Consider the candlelit hall. To modern eyes, candles suggest peace. A restaurant may place one on a table to create softness. A home might light several in the evening for atmosphere. In a medieval hall, candles were illumination. Without them, darkness arrived. A beeswax candle represented expense. Tallow candles could smell strongly and produce smoke. The flame needed trimming and watching. Candles were beautiful. They were also necessary. The same was true of the hearth. Modern people sometimes light fires for pleasure while the rest of the room is already warm. The flames become decoration. In a castle, the hearth carried responsibility. If the fire failed, a room became colder. If fuel ran short, the household adjusted. If smoke failed to draw, eyes watered. If sparks reached rushes or cloth, everyone suddenly had a different problem. The romantic fire was an appliance with no switch. Its maintenance required human attention. Some chroniclers claim that great households consumed such quantities of wood that local supplies became a constant concern, though surviving figures are difficult to compare across estates. Fuel use depended on climate, household size, building design, and the number of occupied hearths. The larger lesson remains simple. Warmth required resources. A castle displayed power partly because it could gather those resources. Wood came from managed forests. Coal appeared in some regions and periods, especially where available, though its domestic use varied. Peat provided fuel elsewhere. Carts travelled. Labourers cut and carried. Account keepers recorded quantities. The glowing hall rested on an economy of heat. Even the bright colours associated with medieval interiors can mislead modern viewers. Rich red hangings and gold decorations suggest visual warmth. Medieval people certainly valued colour. Churches, manuscripts, furniture, clothing, and elite interiors could be far more colourful than the grey stone ruins left today imply. But red cloth did not produce heat. A painted wall remained cold. A golden cup could chill the hand. Beauty and discomfort sat beside one another without contradiction. At a winter feast the scene could be magnificent. Musicians played, platters arrived, spiced wine circulated, wax candles illuminated heraldic banners, guests spoke beneath timber rafters. Near the central warmth faces reddened. Farther away someone kept a cloak fastened. A servant entered from the courtyard with wet shoulders. The door opened. A draught passed across the floor. Then the music continued. This is perhaps the image worth keeping. Not a miserable dungeon of endless freezing. Not a cosy fantasy where fire defeated winter. A living place between the two. The castle was full of adjustments. People moved their stools. They drew curtains. They wrapped feet. They requested more wood. They shut shutters. Then when the room grew too smoky, they opened something again. There was a subtle comedy in the arrangement, though medieval residents may not always have appreciated it. To gain heat, they made fire. The fire demanded air. The air entered through openings and brought cold. They blocked the openings. Smoke gathered. They opened them again. The building and the household negotiated throughout the day. Neither side won completely. Medieval beliefs also coloured the interpretation of unusual cold. A room that remained persistently chilled could acquire a reputation. Perhaps someone had died there. Perhaps a troubling event had occurred. Perhaps the chamber stood above an old foundation, or near a chapel where a strange story was remembered. Some chroniclers described supernatural cold or unexplained disturbances, although those accounts are difficult to separate from literary tradition and later retelling. A modern surveyor might find a cracked wall. A medieval chaplain might bring blessed water. The residents might welcome both solutions if both were available. The supernatural did not erase practical knowledge. People could fear a spirit and still repair the shutter. By late evening, the castle's most beautiful illusion became strongest. Darkness hid the damp exterior walls. Candles softened rough surfaces. Firelight moved across tapestries. The hall appeared enclosed within warmth. Outside, watchfires glowed along the defences. Beyond them, winter fields lay beneath mist. A village slept around low hearths. The abbey bells had grown quiet. Roads disappeared into darkness. Within the castle, someone listening to music might briefly forget the cold. Perhaps that moment is what later generations remembered. The feast, the flame, the woven colours, the sound of voices beneath the roof. Memory often keeps the brightest parts. The wood carrying vanishes. The ash clearing vanishes. The cracked fingers vanish. The frozen basin in the morning vanishes. What remains is candlelight. And so the medieval castle became warmer in imagination than it had ever been in stone. Yet behind the stories the older building still waits. Its walls are damp. Its stairs are cold. A narrow window admits winter air. A servant crosses the courtyard with another armful of logs. The fire burns brightly because it must. And somewhere in the hall, beneath all the colour and ceremony, someone quietly moves a bench a little closer to the hearth. The bench moves closer to the hearth, and for a little while the flames continue their quiet work. But every medieval fire, however carefully tended, eventually begins to sink. The largest logs collapse inward. Bright orange edges darken. Sparks rise briefly and disappear above the hearth while the shadows along the walls grow longer and less certain. Night settles completely over the castle. The last meal has been cleared away. Wooden trenchers, bowls and cups have been carried toward the kitchens. A servant has swept the most obvious scraps from beneath the tables. The rushes lie disturbed where boots crossed them throughout the day. Near the entrance, damp cloaks hang from wooden pegs. Some are still cold. Some smell faintly of rain horse smoke and wool. The great hall, which only hours ago contained voices and movement, begins to empty. A clerk closes his writing box. The ink is covered. Parchment is gathered carefully and carried away from any place where damp might reach it. A household officer checks that an important chest has been locked. Keys hang from a belt. Their small metal sound follows him into the passage. One by one, doors close. The castle grows larger when people become quiet. During the day, servants and retainers fill its spaces. A stair is only a stair because someone is climbing it. A courtyard is filled with horses, baskets, carts, and shouted instructions. The hall belongs to meals and business. At night the stone seems to return to itself. Corridors stretch into darkness. Unused chambers wait behind oak doors. The chapel stands nearly silent. A single flame may remain before a sacred image according to household custom, though practices differed, and historians continue to debate the precise arrangements of private castle chapels from one period to another. The wax burns slowly. Its light touches stone. Somewhere above, wind passes around a tower. The watch continues. A castle could never sleep entirely. Guards remained at gates, walls, or towers according to the needs of the fortress. In peaceful years, their duties could become deeply repetitive. In uncertain times, every distant movement mattered more. Tonight, nothing unusual approaches. The road beyond the gate is empty. A watchman walks a familiar route along the wall. His cloak is pulled close. Wool covers his head. The stones beneath his shoes have already begun gathering frost. At the corner of the tower, the wind is stronger. He knows this before reaching it. He has known it for years. Perhaps there is a small watchfire or brazier nearby, depending upon the design and routines of the castle. Perhaps another guard waits in a sheltered room with coals glowing beside him. Warmth on watch was never guaranteed. The man outside keeps moving. Movement protects his feet from the worst numbness. He looks across the dark countryside. Fields lie almost invisible. Bare hedges divide strips of land. Far below, the roofs of a village form low shapes beneath the night. Most windows are dark. A few houses still possess firelight. In one cottage, someone has remained awake beside a sick child. A woman places another piece of fuel onto the hearth. Perhaps dried herbs are steeping in a small vessel. Sage might be used, or mint, or another plant preserved from warmer months. Some local remedy has been recommended by an older neighbour. No one can quite agree how much trust medieval villagers placed in every folk treatment, because beliefs were personal, local, and rarely written down by those who practiced them. The mother uses the remedy anyway. Then she draws a wool covering closer around the child. The castle watchman cannot see this. He sees only one small light. Farther away, an abbey is also awake. The monastic day belongs partly to darkness. A bell sounds. Its voice travels through the cold, across fields, over roofs, along the muddy road where wagon wheels have hardened into frozen ruts. The sound reaches the castle faintly. The watchman hears it. So does a servant lying beneath a wool blanket. So does a nobleman enclosed behind bed curtains. For one moment, rank makes little difference to the ear. The bell belongs to distance. Then it fades. Within the castle chamber, a fireplace has almost gone out. A servant might once have been instructed to maintain it longer, but fuel is not limitless. The household has already consumed wood throughout the day. The remaining coals glow beneath ash. Bed curtains have been drawn. A fur-lined garment lies across a wooden chest. Shoes wait near the bed. Water in a basin becomes colder. The stone walls begin taking back the small amount of warmth the fire created. This has happened every night of the winter. It happened to the previous lord. It may have happened to his father. Long before the tapestry was woven, the wall behind it knew cold. Long after the current household disappears from memory, the stone may still stand. This is one of the quietest truths held by old castles. People pass through them. The buildings remain. A child grows up learning which corridor is coldest. Years later, that child becomes the lord or lady of the household. New servants arrive. Old servants disappear. A carpenter repairs the same door another carpenter once repaired. Fresh rushes cover the same floor. A tapestry is inherited. A chair becomes worn along its arms. A wooden step bends slightly beneath decades of feet. Generations complain about winter. Each generation believes its own cold immediate, and it is. Perhaps a chimney is eventually improved. A larger glazed window appears. The room is divided. A newer residence is built within the walls. What seemed luxurious becomes ordinary. Then another generation asks for something better. The castle changes, very slowly. Stone remembers each alteration in seams of mortar and blocked doorways. An arrow slit becomes a cupboard. A defensive chamber becomes a bedroom. A tower once filled with armed men holds folded linen. Peace changes buildings as certainly as war. So does the desire to be warm. Centuries later, the fires go out for entirely different reasons. Households leave. Roofs collapse. Timber is removed. Windows break. Tapestries disappear into other collections or vanish completely. Rain enters rooms where noble beds once stood. Grass grows in courtyards. Birds nest in wall openings. The castle becomes a ruin, and a strange transformation occurs. Without people, the building appears more naturally cold. Visitors expect it. They walk beneath broken arches and touch damp stone. Wind passes through empty windows. No one asks why the room is not warm. There is no room anymore, only walls. But once someone slept there. Once bed curtains were closed against winter. Once a servant crossed the floor holding a warming pan or an armful of wood. Once someone sat near a window struggling to use the last daylight for sewing. Once a clerk rubbed his hands together before returning to an account. Once a guard entered from the wall and stood silently near a hearth until feeling returned to his fingers. These moments leave almost no trace. History preserves battles more easily. It remembers the date of a siege. It records a king's visit. It counts soldiers. It identifies marriages and inheritances. But the cold was present between such events. It filled the ordinary days that no chronicler thought important enough to describe. And perhaps that is why the cold matters. It brings the castle back to human size. The fortress no longer stands only as a symbol of war or royal power. It becomes a home where someone searched for dry socks of wool. A workplace where a servant dreaded the frozen courtyard before sunrise. A chapel where knees ached on stone. A hall where a bowl of hot pottage felt comforting. A bed enclosed by curtains. A fire watched carefully. A door closed quickly against the wind. Outside, the watchfire burns lower. The guard adds fuel if fuel is available. A soft glow touches the nearby wall. Beyond it, the fields rest beneath moonlight. The village is quiet now. The last cottage flame disappears. At the abbey, footsteps pass along a covered walk and fade. The road between them all remains empty. Tomorrow it will fill again. A merchant may lead a horse through the mud. A pilgrim may pause beside a roadside shrine. A messenger may carry a sealed letter toward the castle gate. Bells will mark the hours. Kitchen fires will be rebuilt. Water will be carried. Shutters will open. Someone will complain about a draught. Someone will pull a cloak more tightly around the shoulders. Winter will continue, but not tonight. Tonight there is no need to follow the servants into the morning. The wood basket can remain beside the wall. The ink can stay covered. The gates are closed. The castle may rest. The great stone walls, colder than the stories usually remember, rise quietly beneath the night sky. Their towers stand against the stars. Frost gathers along battlements. Far below, a narrow stream moves through darkness. The final embers in the hall lose their colour. Orange becomes red. Red becomes a faint glow beneath ash. And somewhere very far away, perhaps beyond the forest and across fields hidden by mist, a bell rings once more. The sound is soft now. There is time between each echo, time for old roads to disappear, time for watchfires to fade, time for the castle walls to become only shadows. Kings have passed, servants have passed, pilgrims, monks, cooks, guards, children, clerks, and lords have passed. Winter followed them all for a little while, then spring came, and winter returned. Generation after generation. The stone remained patient. Now even the bell is fading. The village sleeps. The abbey is dark. No footsteps cross the frozen courtyard. The last fire has settled gently into ash. And the medieval world, with its cold halls and candlelit chambers, its wool blankets and muddy roads, its distant bells and slow winter fields, can drift quietly away. Let the towers grow dim. Let the roads become still. Let the firelight disappear from the walls. There is nothing more that needs tending tonight. The doors are closed. The blankets are drawn close. The old castle is silent. And all is well.